Welcome to Neo Atlantis.
Pirate First's pipe dream, The Cenote Chronicles, begins.
Part 11. Medicine and Longevity. MXDM, aka Pirate 1 or VJ, Cinemiex. July 22nd, 2026. Chapter 1. Living Under Pressure. The surface world's medicine is organized around the concept of normal, the blood pressure reading that falls within the reference range, the cholesterol level that the risk calculator places below the intervention threshold, the fasting glucose that the diagnostic criteria classify as not diabetic, the BMI that the chart positions in the acceptable zone. Normal is the statistical description of what most people in the surface world's population have, the central tendency of the distribution that the epidemiological study sample has measured, and the deviation from normal is the pathology that the medical intervention addresses. The concept of normal works within its domain. The reference range for hemoglobin tells the clinician whether the patient's oxygen-carrying capacity is adequate for the tissue's metabolic demands at the surface world's atmospheric oxygen pressure. And the intervention that addresses the hemoglobin below the reference range restores the oxygen-carrying capacity toward the adequacy that the reference range was calibrated to represent. The reference range is useful because it represents the biological conditions that the surface world's 1.0 atmosphere, 21% oxygen, 100% relative humidity at sea level, the specific environmental parameters that the surface world's population inhabits, produces as the distribution of biological outcomes in the population that has lived in these specific environmental parameters across these individuals' specific lifetimes. The reference range is not normal. It is the surface world's normal, the biological outcome distribution that the surface world's specific environmental parameters produce in the population that lives in them. The Cenote installation's therapeutic pressure range produces different normal, the biological outcome distribution that 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres of ambient pressure, 36% oxygen partial pressure, and the specific water chemistry and temperature of the freshwater zone's mid-column depth produce in the population that lives in these specific environmental parameters across the design life's enrolled duration. The different environmental parameters produce different biological outcomes, not necessarily pathological deviations from the surface world's reference range, but systematic biological differences that the surface world's medicine's epidemiological studies have not characterized in the free-living population because no free-living population has previously inhabited the environmental parameters that the Cenote installation provides. Joseph Deturi's 100 days at 33 feet depth provided the first longitudinal measurement of the human biology's response to sustained moderate pressure exposure in a free-living subject rather than an occupationally exposed deep-sea diver or a therapeutically exposed hyperbaric patient. The telomere extension, the inflammatory marker reduction, and the cardiovascular efficiency improvement that Deturi's post-saturation assessment documented were the surface world's first glimpse of what the biology does when it lives for extended duration in conditions that differ from the surface world's normal in the specific direction that the Chicxulub Arc's Cenote formation provides. Pipe Dream's longevity program is what happens when Deturi's experiment becomes a civilization's standard operating environment. The pressure physiology. The human body's physiological response to ambient pressure above the surface world's 1.0 atmospheres is not a single mechanism. It is the aggregate expression of the pressure's effect on every biological process whose thermodynamics the ambient pressure influences. The comprehensive characterization of all these effects across the full pressure range from 1.0 to 2.0 atmospheres at the nitrox atmosphere's oxygen partial pressure is the Research Commons' most active scientific program, because the founding installation's longitudinal dataset is producing the largest body of evidence on human physiological responses to sustained moderate pressure exposure in free-living individuals that the biomedical literature has ever contained. The mechanistic pathways whose therapeutic significance the Research Commons longitudinal datasets analysis has most clearly characterized are the dissolved oxygen delivery enhancement. The ambient pressure above 1.0 atmospheres increases the atmospheric partial pressure of all gases proportionally, including the oxygen, whose partial pressure at the surface world's 21% oxygen fraction is 0.21 atmospheres. The nitrox atmosphere's oxygen fraction, adjusted by the coordinating system's atmospheric management layer to maintain the oxygen partial pressure within the therapeutic range of 0.3 to 0.4 atmospheres at the specific therapeutic depth, increases the dissolved oxygen delivery to the tissues from the capillary bed's hemoglobin-dependent oxygen transport. The enhanced delivery supplies the tissue's mitochondrial respiration at a rate above the surface world's atmospheric oxygen partial pressure's delivery capacity, supporting the cellular energy production at a higher flux that the telomere repair machinery, the antioxidant defense system, and the protein quality control mechanisms require as the substrate for their optimal operation. The telomere repair machinery's enhancement is the dissolved oxygen delivery's most commercially significant biological consequence. The telomere repair enzymes, telomerases, catalytic activity in the telomere extension reaction requires the ADP that the mitochondrial respiration's enhanced flux produces at the therapeutic pressure's elevated oxygen delivery. The telomere extension rate is the biochemical output whose measurement the Bloodworks telomere length assessment captures as the primary longevity program outcome indicator. The enrolled participant, whose weekly blood work shows the telomere extension rate above the surface world's baseline erosion rate, is the participant whose biology is responding to the therapeutic pressure's oxygen delivery enhancement with the telomere maintenance that the longevity program's clinical protocol targets. The inflammatory regulation. The ambient pressure's influence on the inflammatory pathway's biological chemistry extends beyond the dissolved oxygen delivery's antioxidant supply to the direct effect of elevated pressure on the specific inflammatory signaling molecule's conformational chemistry. The inflammatory cytokine's receptor binding affinity changes with the ambient pressure at the specific pressure range of 1.2 to 1.5 atmospheres in the direction that reduces the inflammatory response's intensity. The same physical mechanism that the surface world's hyperbaric oxygen therapy literature has documented for wound healing and inflammatory arthritis applications, extended to the sustained exposure duration that the cenote installation's residential environment provides rather than the episodic treatment sessions that the surface world's hyperbaric oxygen facility delivers. The sustained exposure duration's anti-inflammatory effect is the founding installation's most statistically robust finding. The enrolled participants' inflammatory marker panel, the C-reactive protein, the interleukin-6, and the tumor necrosis factor alpha, shows the sustained reduction that the weekly Bloodworks longitudinal analysis identifies as a progressive response to the sustained therapeutic pressure rather than the acute response to the single hyperbaric session that the surface world's hyperbaric oxygen therapy literature describes. The progressive response suggests a regulatory mechanism whose full expression requires the sustained duration that the residential enrollment provides, a mechanism whose characterization is the Research Commons' most actively investigated scientific question. The cardiovascular efficiency enhancement. The ambient pressure's hydrostatic effect on the venous return from the lower extremities, the pressure that the water column exerts on the submerged lower body in the Scaphandre session's aquatic context, and the atmospheric pressure's equivalent hydrostatic effect on the peripheral vasculature's compliance in the atmospheric residential context, increases the venous return at the heart's preload, which the Frank-Starling mechanism converts to the increased stroke volume that reduces the heart rate required for the same cardiac output. The reduced heart rate at the equivalent cardiac output is the cardiovascular efficiency improvement that the enrolled participants' resting heart rate monitoring captures across the enrollment period. The nitrox atmosphere's specific contribution. The nitrox atmosphere is not merely the vehicle for increasing the oxygen partial pressure above the surface world's 21% oxygen fractions delivery. The specific oxygen-nitrogen mixture at the therapeutic depth's pressure produces the breathing gas whose physiological effects differ from the pure oxygen at the therapeutic pressure and from the surface world's air at the therapeutic pressure in the specific ways that the founding installation's longitudinal datasets, controlled comparisons characterize. The pure oxygen at 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres ambient pressure produces the oxygen partial pressure of 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres, above the therapeutic ranges 0.3 to 0.4 atmospheres, and within the central nervous system oxygen toxicity risk range that the hyperbaric medicine's clinical literature identifies as the seizure threshold's proximity. The nitrox mixture's oxygen fraction, adjusted to maintain 0.3 to 0.4 atmospheres partial pressure at the therapeutic depth, provides the therapeutic oxygen delivery without the CNS oxygen toxicity risk that the pure oxygen at the equivalent pressure would produce. The nitrogen in the nitrox mixture is not an inert diluent at the therapeutic pressure range, is not the narcosis, but the nitrogen supersaturations management across the depth transitions that the enrolled participants' daily movement between the surface tier and the therapeutic depth produces. The nitrogen dissolved in the participants' tissues at the therapeutic depth must be eliminated through the respiratory system's off-gassing during the ascent from the therapeutic depth to the surface tier, and the ascent rate must be controlled to prevent the nitrogen bubble formation in the tissues and the vasculature that the decompression sickness mechanism produces when the ascent rate exceeds the off-gassing rate's capacity to maintain the supersaturation below the bubble nucleation threshold. The ascent rate management is the coordinating system's atmospheric management layer's most safety-critical active function for the enrolled participant population. The ascent rate schedule that the individual participant's time at depth and depth profile produces as the decompression obligation is calculated by the coordinating system's decompression model for each participant's daily depth profile. And the crystal tube network's transit speed management enforces the ascent rate that the decompression model specifies as the maximum safe rate for the individual participant's accumulated nitrogen loading. The decompression model's calculation is not the Surface World's dive table's prescribed ascent schedule. It is the individualized decompression obligation that the participant's specific depth, time, and physiological nitrogen elimination rate produces as the bubble nucleation thresholds management calculation. The individual physiological nitrogen elimination rate is the medical monitoring's most physiologically specific parameter. The participant whose nitrogen elimination rate is slower than the population average, whose tissue half-times are longer, requires the longer ascent schedule that the decompression model's individualized calculation produces, while the participant whose elimination rate is faster can ascend more quickly without exceeding the bubble nucleation threshold. The individualized decompression management is the longevity program's medical monitoring's most direct expression of the person-specific medicine that the founding charter's therapeutic philosophy requires, not the population average's decompression schedule applied uniformly to every enrolled participant regardless of the individual physiological differences that the nitrogen elimination rate's individual variation reflects, but the individual-specific schedule that the individual's physiological parameters produce as the safe ascent management for this specific person's specific depth profile and specific physiological characteristics. The founding data. Joseph Deturi's experiment produced the founding dataset that the longevity program's therapeutic protocol is built on. The first published longitudinal measurements of the human biology's response to sustained moderate pressure exposure in a free-living subject at the specific pressure range and duration that the Cenote installation's therapeutic protocol was designed to extend and systematize. The founding dataset's specific findings: the telomere extension of 20% above the baseline rate across the 100-day exposure period, the inflammatory marker reduction of 50% below the baseline level across the same period, and the cardiovascular efficiency improvement of 15% in the resting heart rate at equivalent workload, established the therapeutic effects existence at the pressure and duration that the founding installations first enrolled participants would experience. The founding dataset's limitation was the single subject's characterization, the individual variation in the therapeutic response that the population's biological diversity produces was not characterizable from the single subject's observations, and the mechanism's characterization that the single subject's measurements suggest required the larger population's replicated observations to achieve the statistical power that the mechanism's specific characterization demands. The founding installation's first enrolled cohort's observations are the single subject's characterization's replicated extension, the diverse population that the longevity program's first enrollment produced, diverse in age, in sex, in baseline biological age assessment, in surface world health history, and in the physiological characteristics that the medical monitoring's comprehensive baseline evaluation documents, is the statistical power source for the mechanism's characterization and the individual variations documentation. The cohort's first year's bloodwork data established the therapeutic effects population-level existence, The telomere extension rate was above the surface world's baseline erosion rate in the statistically significant majority of the first cohort's enrolled participants. The inflammatory marker reduction was present at the population level with individual variation in magnitude that the baseline biological age assessment's correlation analysis has begun to characterize, and the cardiovascular efficiency improvements population-level presence established the first year's therapeutic effect at the statistical significance that the Research Commons publication standard requires. The first year's publication in the Research Commons Longevity Science Publication Series is the founding installation's most scientifically significant output in the first enrollment period. The peer-reviewed documentation of the therapeutic effects population-level existence in the first enrolled cohort, with the statistical analysis that the scientific community's evaluation requires for the biological credibility that the longevity program's commercial model depends on. The publication is also the founding installation's most commercially significant strategic event. The research community's engagement with the published findings produces the scientific scrutiny that either validates the therapeutic effect's biological credibility or identifies the methodological limitations that the next Research Commons study design must address. The scientific scrutiny's outcome determines whether the therapeutic effect is the biological reality that the founding installation's observations represent or the artifact of the methodological limitations that the single installation's non-randomized enrollment produces. Saturation residence. The saturation resident is the longevity program's most physiologically committed participant, the permanent resident whose continuous depth residence at the therapeutic range's assigned position, not the daily depth transit between the surface tier and the therapeutic depth, but the sustained occupancy at therapeutic depth across the full residential period, produces the therapeutic exposure duration that the surface world's hyperbaric medicine has not previously studied in a free-living human population. The saturation resident is the Research Commons' most scientifically valuable longitudinal observation subject, the individual whose biology is continuously exposed to the therapeutic pressure for the months to years of the extended residential period is the individual whose biology's long-horizon response to the sustained exposure the short-term enrolled cohort's first year cannot characterize. The saturation resident's blood work at year 5, year 10, and year 20 is the longitudinal dataset's most scientifically distinctive content, the temporal depth that the cross-sectional study of different individuals at different enrollment durations cannot replace. The saturation resident's daily life is the residential accommodation's atmospheric and pressure management in a sustained form, not the day's transit from the surface tier to the therapeutic depth and the evening's return to the surface tier's social environment, but the full day and night in the therapeutic depth's gallery ring and the therapeutic pressure's nitrox atmosphere. The social environment is the therapeutic depth's communal gallery and the connected gallery ring's permanent resident population, rather than the surface tier's broader longevity program enrollment cohort that the daily depth transit participants share their social environment with. The saturation resident's most significant physiological challenge is the decompression management's long-term consequence. The body's continuous nitrogen loading at the therapeutic depth produces the equilibration of the tissue nitrogen concentrations with the ambient pressure's nitrogen partial pressure. The saturation state, where the tissue nitrogen is at the dissolved concentration that the ambient partial pressure's thermodynamic equilibrium specifies. The saturation state eliminates the daily decompression obligation that the depth transit participant's daily ascent produces, because the tissue nitrogen is already at the equilibrated concentration for the therapeutic depth's ambient pressure, and the ascent to the surface tier requires the full decompression from the saturation depth that the decompression protocol's most extended schedule addresses. The saturation resident's ascent to the surface tier is the most significant planned decompression event in the longevity program's medical protocol. The decompression from the therapeutic saturation depth to the surface tier's 1.0 atmosphere requires the extended ascent schedule whose duration exceeds the day transit participants' daily decompression obligation by the factor that the saturation state's tissue nitrogen equilibration produces. The saturation resident's surface world visit, the medical appointment, the personal event, the institutional engagement that the Principality Deal's external relationship requires, must be planned around the decompression schedule's duration, which the coordinating system's decompression model specifies as the individual's saturation depth and physiological nitrogen elimination rates function. The saturation resident who has lived at the therapeutic depth for years and requires a surface world visit of several days faces the decompression and recompression sequence whose total physiological burden, the nitrogen bubble nucleation risk of the decompression and the nitrogen reloading of the recompression, is the medical monitoring's most carefully managed intervention in the longevity program's full clinical practice. The Coordinating Systems Decompression Model, the Terraform Operators Clinical Review, and the Research Commons Decompression Medicine Specialists' concurrent review together produce the decompression and recompression protocol for the saturation residence surface world visit, the most demanding clinical protocol in the longevity program's medical management. What pressure does not do? The therapeutic pressure's biological effects are real. The founding installation's longitudinal dataset documents them at the statistical significance that the Research Commons publication standard requires. The therapeutic pressure's biological effects are also bounded. The specific mechanisms whose enhancement the therapeutic pressure produces have the biological limits that the biochemical system's architecture specifies, and the therapeutic pressure's enhancement of the specific mechanisms operates within those limits rather than transcending them. The therapeutic pressure does not reverse aging. The telomere extension rate above the surface world's baseline erosion rate is a deceleration of the biological clock's progression toward the cellular senescence that the telomere length's critical shortening eventually produces, not a reversal of the existing telomere damage or the restoration of the telomere length that the subject's biological age before enrollment represents. The enrolled participant whose telomere length was at the 50-year-old biological age marker's position at enrollment will have the telomere length that the enrollment's enhanced extension rate has added to the 50-year position, still shorter than the 20-year position that the biological reversal of aging would require. The therapeutic pressure does not prevent disease. The inflammatory marker's reduction below the surface world's baseline level reduces the chronic inflammation's contribution to the disease risk that the inflammatory biology's decades of research has identified as the cardiovascular disease, the neurodegenerative disease, and the metabolic disease's shared pathophysiology. The risk reduction is real, and its clinical significance is the Research Commons' most actively investigated application. The risk reduction is not the disease's prevention in the absolute sense. The enrolled participant with a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease will not be protected from the genetic risk's expression by the inflammatory marker's reduction, though the inflammatory component's reduction may delay the clinical expression's timing beyond what the unmodified inflammatory biology would produce. The therapeutic pressure does not extend life indefinitely. The longevity program's therapeutic philosophy is the health span's extension, the period of biological function at the level that the enrolled participants' subjective quality of life and the objective physical and cognitive performance assessments together characterize as healthy, rather than the lifespan's extension through the medical technology's biological life maintenance beyond the point that the individual's own biology would sustain in the therapeutic environment's absence. The health span's extension is the therapeutic pressure's realistic claim. The enrolled participant who completes the extended enrollment protocol and maintains the saturation residency that the medical monitoring confirms as producing the biological response the protocol targets will have the health span that the biological age assessment at enrollment, the therapeutic response's individual magnitude, and the biological processes that the therapeutic pressure does not affect together determine. The health span's extension beyond the surface world's population norm is the therapeutic effect's practical expression, not the indefinite life extension that the surface world's longevity marketing often implies. The founding charter's transparency requirement in the longevity program's commercial communication is the realistic claim's institutional expression. The longevity program's marketing cannot represent the therapeutic effect beyond what the Research Commons longitudinal datasets documented evidence supports. And the Research Commons publication standards peer review is the documentary evidence's quality control. The founding charter's transparency requirement and the Research Commons publication standard together constitute the commercial communications scientific integrity governance, the provision that prevents the longevity marketing's claims from exceeding the biological evidence that the scientific community's evaluation confirms. Medicine in the formation. The cenote installation's medical practice is the surface world's medicine practiced in a different environmental context, not a replacement for the surface world's medical knowledge, but the extension of that knowledge to the specific physiological conditions that the therapeutic pressure, the nitrox atmosphere, and the formation's ecological environment produce in the enrolled participants' biology. The medical practice's most distinctive element is the integration with the formation's biological environment. The Scaphandar session's moderate aerobic exercise in the therapeutic pressure's nitrox atmosphere is simultaneously the therapeutic protocol's exercise component and the ecological encounter that the living pantry's Bodo population's boundary harvesting behavior provides as the exercise session's environmental context. The enrolled participant, who is swimming in the therapeutic pressure's nitrox atmosphere through the formation's freshwater zone, within the range of the Bodo's acoustic echolocation, performing the aerobic exercise that the therapeutic protocol's exercise component specifies, is receiving the combined therapeutic benefit of the pressure, the nitrox, and the exercise in the ecological context that the formation's biological community provides as the environmental background. The combined therapeutic benefit is more than the additive sum of the pressure's contribution, the nitrox's contribution, and the exercise's contribution, the formation's ecological environment, the specific sensory richness of the freshwater zone's biological community, the specific acoustic quality of the cenote's underwater soundscape, the specific thermal experience of the formation's temperature gradient, produces the psychological and neurological engagement that the surface world's evidence-based medicine identifies as the health benefits amplifier. The nature immersion's established anti-inflammatory effect, the sensory richness's cognitive stimulation, and the physical mastery's psychological reinforcement that the Scaphandar session's challenging aquatic exercise produces in the enrolled participant whose competence in the formation's environment grows with the enrollment period's experiential accumulation. The formation's contribution to the therapeutic protocol is not quantified in the Research Commons longitudinal dataset at the precision that the pressures and the nitrox's specific contributions are quantified, because the formation's contribution's specific mechanisms are more complex and more distributed across the biological pathways than the pressures and the nitrox's specific mechanistic contributions. The formation's contribution is the qualitative context within which the quantifiable therapeutic mechanisms operate, the environmental condition whose specific character the enrolled participant's biological response reflects as the aggregate of mechanisms that the Research Commons scientific program is working to disentangle from the pressures and the nitrox's specific contributions. The disentanglement is the Research Commons Therapeutic Medicine Research Program's most methodologically challenging project. The randomized controlled trial that would isolate the formation's contribution from the pressures and the nitrox's contributions would require the control condition of a pressurized nitrox environment without the formation's ecological richness. A hyperbaric chamber whose sterile interior eliminates the formation's sensory environment to isolate the formation's contribution as the difference between the chamber's outcome and the cenote's outcome. The chamber's sterile control is achievable. The enrolled participants' willingness to live in the chamber rather than the cenote for the enrollment period's duration is the protocol's recruitment challenge, whose ethical dimensions the Research Commons ethics review must address before the study design's execution. Medicine in the formation is medicine whose specific character the formation produces, and the research program is still fully characterizing. The formation is the therapeutic context. The context is the medicine's most important variable. The medicine's most important variable is the formation that the civilization inhabits. The formation heals what it heals. The science measures what it measures. The measurement trails the healing. The healing is real regardless of the measurement's current precision. Cross-references. Part 2, CH3, Materials that let civilization disappear. Part 6, CH2, Scaphandars for everyone. Part 6, CH5, Sleeping inside the aquifer. Part 8, Section A, CH4, From resort to municipality. Part 11, CH2, The nitrox galleries. Part 11, CH3, Telomere economics. Part 11, CH4, The research commons. Part 11, CH5, Cognitive enhancement at depth. Part 11, CH6, The longevity principality. 4. Decompression model individualized schedule calculation and saturation resident surface world visit protocol. See Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4 Therapeutic Pressure Range Nitrox Atmosphere Oxygen Fraction Management and CNS Oxygen Toxicity Monitoring. See Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4 Longevity Program, Transparency Requirement Commercial Communication Standard and Research Commons Publication Evidence Quality Control. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. 4 Scaphandar Session Therapeutic Protocol Exercise Component Specification and Ecological Encounter Therapeutic Benefit Integration. See Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. Medicine and Longevity. Chapter 2, The Nitrox Galleries. A gallery is not a room. The surface world's architectural vocabulary distinguishes the two with a precision that the common usage has softened but not erased. The room is enclosed, its walls defining the perimeter that separates the interior from the exterior, its function expressed in the furnishings that the interior's purpose requires. The gallery is linear, its length exceeding its width by the ratio that the movement through the space requires, its function expressed in the journey that the length allows rather than the dwelling that the room provides. The art gallery's walls display the works that the passage through the space encounters in sequence. The ship's gallery corridor connects the compartments that the vessel's operational program requires without being any of them. The gallery is the space of movement between, not the space of occupation within. The nitrox galleries are not rooms. They are the crystal tube network's therapeutic zone, the specific depth range of the freshwater zone's atmospheric infrastructure whose nitrox atmosphere, managed by the coordinating system's atmospheric management layer at the therapeutic oxygen partial pressure, constitutes the biological environment within which the longevity program's enrolled participants move throughout the enrollment period's daily routine. Not the specific gallery ring where the participant sleeps, that is the accommodation section, the room. Not the specific gallery ring where the participant eats, that is the dining gallery, the room. The nitrox galleries are the continuous atmospheric environment whose maintenance the entire therapeutic depth range provides as the passage through which the participant's daily movement occurs. The gallery in the architectural sense of the space whose therapeutic function is realized through the participant's movement within it across the full daily cycle. The nitrox gallery's therapeutic function is the continuous atmospheric exposure that the movement through the therapeutic zone produces, not the episodic treatment session that the surface world's hyperbaric medicine delivers in the hyperbaric chamber's scheduled visit, but the continuous immersion in the therapeutic atmosphere that the residential enrollment provides as the daily biological context whose sustained duration the therapeutic mechanism's full expression requires. The continuous exposure argument. The surface world's hyperbaric oxygen therapy is delivered in sessions, the 90-minute to 2-hour exposure at the therapeutic pressure that the treatment protocol specifies, administered 1 to 2 times daily for the treatment course's duration, with the surface world's atmospheric pressure between sessions. The session-based delivery is the surface world's hyperbaric medicine's operational format because the surface world's hyperbaric chamber is a clinical facility whose occupancy the hospital's operational scheduling manages, and the clinical scheduling's optimization produces the session format rather than the continuous exposure that the physiological mechanism's most effective delivery would require. The session's physiological limitation is the off-gassing that occurs between sessions. The tissue nitrogen's dissolution in the therapeutic pressure's atmosphere is reversed during the surface world's atmospheric pressure between sessions, and the dissolved oxygen's enhanced tissue delivery is reduced to the surface world's 21% oxygen fraction's delivery rate between sessions. The therapeutic effect's magnitude in the session format reflects the session's duration, the intersession interval's physiological reversal, and the net effect of the repeated sessions across the treatment course. The continuous exposure's physiological advantage is the sustained dissolution. The tissue nitrogen saturation at the therapeutic pressure's nitrogen partial pressure is maintained across the full enrollment period without the between-session off-gassing that the session format's surface world pressure interval produces. The dissolved oxygen's enhanced delivery is maintained continuously rather than episodically. The physiological mechanism's full expression, the telomere extension rate, the inflammatory marker reduction, the cardiovascular efficiency enhancement, accumulates across the continuous exposure without the intersession reversal that the session format's delivery produces. The continuous exposure argument is the founding charter's therapeutic philosophy's most specific scientific claim. The biological effects that the therapeutic pressure produces at the session format's limited duration are real, but incomplete. And the biological effects that the continuous exposure format produces across the residential enrollment's extended duration are the therapeutic mechanism's full expression that the session format's limited duration cannot achieve. The founding installation's longitudinal dataset's first year of enrolled participant data tests this argument against the founding evidence. The enrolled participants whose blood work at weeks 4, 8, 12, and 24 shows the progressive biological response. The telomere extension rates continued increase rather than the plateau that the session format's repeated sessions would produce. When the saturation state's partial reversal limits the cumulative effect, provides the evidence that the continuous exposure's progressive biology differs from the session format's plateau biology in the direction that the continuous exposure argument predicts. The progressive biology is the most important evidentiary claim in the founding installation's first-year publication, not the therapeutic effect's magnitude at any single measurement point, but the trajectory's progression across measurement points that distinguishes the continuous exposure's cumulative biology from the session format's plateau biology. The trajectory's progression is what the continuous exposure argument predicts and what the founding installation's longitudinal dataset's first year begins to confirm. The Gallery Zones. The nitrox gallery's atmospheric management is organized by the Zone Designation System's therapeutic depth assignment. The specific gallery ring at the specific depth that the enrolled participant's bloodwork-based protocol assignment specifies receives the nitrox atmosphere, whose oxygen fraction the coordinating system's atmospheric management layer maintains at the oxygen partial pressure that the therapeutic depth's ambient pressure and the target oxygen partial pressure together determine. Zone 1. The surface tier's orientation galleries is the longevity program's entry zone. 1.0 atmosphere ambient pressure, standard 21% oxygen fraction, standard atmospheric nitrogen fraction. The orientation zone is the first environment the enrolled participant inhabits before any depth transit, used for the baseline biological assessment that the enrollment's first 72 hours produces and for the surface world-to-formation physiological adaptation that the transition from the surface world's atmospheric conditions to the formation's enclosed atmospheric environment requires. Zone 2, the upper therapeutic range, from 1.1 to 1.25 atmospheres, is the early enrollment zone. The depth range where the first bloodwork assessment's telomere length, inflammatory marker panel, and cardiovascular efficiency baseline is compared against the initial biological response that the first 2 weeks at this depth produces, establishing the enrolled participant's individual response characteristic that the depth assignment algorithm uses to determine whether the protocol's progression toward the deeper therapeutic range is warranted by the biological response's initial indication. Zone 3. The core therapeutic range, from 1.25 to 1.40 atmospheres, is the primary longevity program's therapeutic zone. The depth range where the majority of the enrolled participants' protocol assignments concentrate during the middle weeks of the enrollment period, when the bloodwork's cumulative biological response has established the enrolled participants' individual response characteristic at the level that the core therapeutic range's ambient pressure targets. The nitrox atmosphere in Zone 3 maintains the oxygen partial pressure at 0.32 to 0.38 atmospheres, the range that the therapeutic oxygen delivery's upper bound and the CNS oxygen toxicity risk's lower bound together specify as the protocol's target range at the core therapeutic zone's ambient pressure. Zone 4. The deep therapeutic range, from 1.40 to 1.55 atmospheres, is the enhanced enrollment zone. The depth range where the enrolled participants whose blood work at week 8 shows the biological response magnitude that the protocol's deep therapeutic range deployment criterion specifies receive the depth assignment that the enhanced biological environment provides. The nitrox atmosphere in Zone 4 maintains the oxygen partial pressure at 0.34 to 0.40 atmospheres, the range that requires the oxygen fraction reduction from the surface world's 21% to the 15 to 17% that the ambient pressure's multiplication of the atmospheric partial pressure requires to maintain the target therapeutic range. Zone 5, the saturation zone, from 1.55 to 2.0 atmospheres, is the permanent residential zone. The depth range that the saturation residents whose permanent residency protocols medical monitoring has confirmed as the sustainable depth assignment for the individual's physiological response characterization occupy as the continuous atmospheric environment whose sustained duration the saturation residency produces. The nitrox atmosphere in Zone 5 maintains the oxygen partial pressure at the biological optimum for the saturation residence specific physiological profiles, requiring the most precisely managed oxygen fraction adjustment in the atmospheric management system's zone-specific management. The atmospheric management layer. The coordinating system's atmospheric management layer is the nitrox gallery's most operationally demanding function. The real-time monitoring and adjustment of the atmospheric composition, the oxygen fraction, the nitrogen fraction, the carbon dioxide concentration, and the trace gas concentrations. In every gallery ring, at every depth zone across the full installed extent of the nitrox gallery's therapeutic zone. The atmospheric management layer's sensor infrastructure is the most densely populated sensor network in the formation. Every gallery ring's atmospheric monitoring requires the oxygen partial pressure sensor, the carbon dioxide sensor, the nitrogen fraction sensor, and the trace gas sensor at the accuracy that the therapeutic protocol's safety specification requires for the CNS oxygen toxicity risks continuous assessment. The CNS oxygen toxicity risk is the atmospheric management layer's primary safety constraint. The oxygen partial pressure that exceeds the CNS oxygen toxicity threshold at the therapeutic depth produces the seizure risk that the hyperbaric medicine's clinical literature identifies as the acute safety event whose prevention the therapeutic protocol's oxygen fraction management must ensure at every moment of every enrolled participant's depth assignment. The oxygen partial pressure's real-time monitoring at the CNS oxygen toxicity threshold's proximity requires the sensor's response time to be below the physiological response time that the toxic partial pressure's onset produces. The sensor that detects the oxygen partial pressure's elevation above the therapeutic range's upper bound must trigger the atmospheric management layer's oxygen fraction reduction within the time interval that the toxic partial pressure's sustained exposure requires to produce the seizure precursor symptoms that the enrolled participant's physiological monitoring detects as the early warning. The sensor response time specification is the atmospheric management layer's most safety-critical engineering parameter. The sensor that responds in milliseconds allows the management layer's oxygen fraction adjustment to prevent the therapeutic upper bound's sustained exceedance that the seizure risk requires. The sensor that responds in minutes allows the sustained exceedance whose physiological consequence the warning detection at the enrolled participant's physiological monitoring may not intercept before the acute clinical event's development. The sensor network's response time specification is milliseconds across the full therapeutic zone's extent. The specification is the safety architecture's standard, not the sensor technology's maximum achievable response time, but the minimum response time that the therapeutic protocol's CNS oxygen toxicity risk management requires. The specification drives the sensor technology selection from the options that the response time's minimum requirement qualifies. The carbon dioxide's management is the atmospheric management layer's most continuous active function. The enrolled participant population's metabolic carbon dioxide production in the therapeutic zone's enclosed atmospheric environment requires the continuous scrubbing that the CO2 scrubber system's active operation provides at the rate that the population's metabolic rate and the zone's atmospheric volume together determine as the CO2 accumulation rate without scrubbing. The scrubbing rates management maintains the CO2 concentration below the physiological discomfort threshold, the 0.5 to 1% concentration range, where the respiratory drive increases and the enrolled participant's awareness of the elevated CO2 is the first indicator of insufficient scrubbing capacity. The scrubbing capacities management is the atmospheric management layer's most logistically demanding function. The CO2 scrubber material's consumption rate at the therapeutic zone's full population's metabolic rate determines the cartridge replacement frequency that the maintenance protocol must schedule and the spare inventory that the utility conduit's chemical supply system must maintain to prevent the scrubbing capacity's exhaustion before the scheduled replacement's next maintenance visit. The gallery as therapeutic environment. The nitrox gallery is not a medical facility. The Surface World's medical facility is designed for the patient's temporary occupancy during the treatment episode. The sterile surfaces, the clinical lighting, The functional furniture, the absence of personal artifacts or aesthetic character that might interfere with the infection control or the clinical function's operational efficiency. The patient arrives for the treatment, receives the treatment, and departs. The medical facility is the treatment's delivery infrastructure, not the patient's habitation environment. The Nitrox Gallery is the enrolled participant's habitation environment. The same therapeutic atmosphere that the medical facility would deliver in the clinical session's scheduled visit pervades the residential gallery, the dining gallery, the communal gathering space, the research commons laboratory galleries, and the crystal tube transit corridor between them. The therapeutic atmosphere is not where the enrolled participant goes to receive the treatment. It is where the enrolled participant lives. The gallery's design reflects this distinction, not the medical facility's sterile clinical character, but the residential environment whose aesthetic character the enrolled participant's extended habitation requires for the psychological well-being that the therapeutic protocol's outcomes research has identified as the therapeutic effects amplifier. The natural material finishes, the limestone surface texture visible through the gallery ring's interior wall panels, the wood-derived composites' warmth in the furniture's tactile character, the textile's acoustic absorption in the personal accommodation section's sonic environment, are the aesthetic provisions that the gallery's design philosophy specifies as the habitation quality requirement alongside the medical protocol's atmospheric specification. The aesthetic provisions are not incidental to the therapeutic protocol. The outcomes research that the founding installation's longitudinal datasets psychological well-being assessment produces alongside the biomarker panel is generating the evidence that the gallery's aesthetic character, the natural material's sensory quality, the formation's visual presence through the transparent hull, the biological community's acoustic background through the hull material's structural vibration transmission contributes to the enrolled participant's cortisol reduction, the psychological engagement, and the cognitive stimulation whose downstream biological effects the inflammatory marker panel's reduction partially reflects as the psychological well-being's physiological expression. The gallery is the therapeutic environment in the broadest sense, not the atmospheric chemistry alone, but the full sensory character of the inhabited geological formation's specific conditions, the pressure, the nitrox atmosphere, the temperature, the light relay's spectral output, the formation's acoustic background, the biological community's visual presence through the transparent hull, and the aesthetic quality of the human-made elements that the gallery's design has specified as the habitation environment's character. All of these together constitute the therapeutic environment whose continuous immersion across the enrollment period produces the biological response that the Bloodworks longitudinal measurement characterizes. The zone transitions. The enrolled participants' daily movement between zones, the transit from the residential zone's therapeutic depth to the surface tier's orientation galleries for the morning orientation session, and the return transit to the therapeutic depth for the remainder of the day, is the zone transition whose physiological management the coordinating system's transit management layer provides as the decompression and recompression schedule's automated enforcement. The zone transition's physiological significance is the nitrogen loading's dynamic. The ascent from the therapeutic depth to the surface tier reduces the ambient pressure that the nitrogen partial pressures product with the nitrogen fraction produces, reducing the dissolved nitrogen's thermodynamic equilibrium concentration in the tissues and requiring the nitrogen's off-gassing through the respiratory system at the rate that the tissue nitrogen's half-time specifies for each tissue types. Nitrogen elimination kinetics. The off-gassing rates management. The ascent rate that prevents the dissolved nitrogen's supersaturation ratio from exceeding the bubble nucleation threshold that the Haldanian decompression model specifies is the transit management layer's decompression schedule's enforcement. The crystal tube network's maglev propulsion speed management during the enrolled participants' ascent transit limits the ascent rate to the decompression schedule's maximum safe value for the individual participants' accumulated nitrogen loading at the current depth and duration. The individual accumulated nitrogen loading is the transit management layer's most participant-specific calculation. The participant who has spent 8 hours at the core therapeutic zone's 1.3 atmospheres has a different accumulated nitrogen loading than the participant who has spent the same 8 hours at the deep therapeutic zone's 1.45 atmospheres. And the transit management layer's decompression schedule for each participant's ascent must reflect the individual's specific depth time. profile rather than the population averages generic schedule. The Transit Management Layer's participant-specific calculation is the longevity program's most computationally intensive real-time function. The decompression model's calculation for every enrolled participant's current nitrogen loading state, updated continuously as the participant's depth profile evolves through the daily movement between zones, requires the classical compute layer's real-time processing at the participant count's full enrollment capacity. The calculation is the longevity program's most safety-critical real-time function and the classical compute layer's most participant-specific load. The zone transitions recompression schedule, the descent from the surface tier to the therapeutic depth, is the inverse physiological management. The nitrogen's reloading in the tissues as the ambient pressure increases with the descent requires the descent rates management to prevent the bubble nucleation that the rapid pressure increase would produce by forcing the dissolved gases supersaturation in the tissues whose nitrogen content the surface pressure intervals off-gassing has reduced below the therapeutic depth's equilibrium concentration. The recompression schedule's enforcement is less safety-critical than the decompression schedule's enforcement. The bubble nucleation risk is primarily a decompression event, and the recompression's physiological risk is the oxygen toxicity risk at the therapeutic depth's arrival rather than the bubble nucleation's vascular obstruction. The recompression schedule's descent rate management is therefore specified by the comfort optimization rather than the safety-critical constraint. The descent rate that minimizes the enrolled participant's ear pressure equalization discomfort and the sinus pressure adjustments physiological accommodation rather than the minimum rate that the decompression model's safety constraint requires. The gallery and isolation. The nitrox gallery's most psychologically demanding characteristic is the isolation from the surface world's atmospheric environment. The enclosed crystal tube section at the therapeutic depth, whose atmospheric interior is the nitrox atmosphere rather than the surface world's air, is separated from the surface world's atmospheric environment by the water column above it, the limestone formation surrounding it, and the crystal tube hole's transparent material boundary. The enrolled participant, who has been at the therapeutic depth for 4 weeks, has been separated from the surface world's atmospheric environment for 4 weeks. Not from the surface world. The Wetlock's Access Management Protocol allows the surface world's visitors to enter the therapeutic zone. The internet connection through the crystal tube's fiber optic infrastructure maintains the enrolled participants' digital connectivity with the surface world's information environment. And the therapeutic depth's communal gallery's social environment provides the enrolled participants' primary social context within the formation. But the surface world's atmospheric environment, the open air, the sky, the weather, the horizon, the sensory character of the unenclosed outdoor environment, is physically absent from the therapeutic depth's inhabited context. The isolation's psychological management is the longevity program's most individually variable clinical challenge. The enrolled participants whose psychological response to the enclosed environment's extended occupancy the pre-enrollment screening assesses as tolerant of confinement are the enrolled participants whose protocol assignments confidently include the extended duration at the therapeutic depth. The enrolled participants whose pre-enrollment screening identifies the claustrophobic response tendency are the enrolled participants whose protocol assignments are managed toward the shallower therapeutic zone's more frequently surfaced daily routine that provides the surface tier's more open spatial environment at the enrollment's periodic intervals. The surface tier's psychological relief is the therapeutic zone's architectural provision for the confinement tolerances management. The surface tier's orientation galleries, whose cenote openings daylight column and natural air exchange with the jungle's atmospheric environment provide the most nature-proximate sensory environment in the installation's full spatial extent, are the enrolled participants' psychological relief valve, the scheduled access to the open natural sensory environment that the therapeutic depth's enclosed atmospheric environment cannot provide within its own spatial extent. The surface tier's relief visits frequency in the enrolled participant's protocol schedule is the confinement tolerance's individualized management. The participant whose pre-enrollment screening confirms high confinement tolerance receives the infrequent surface tier relief visit that the therapeutic depth's maximum continuous exposure allows before the relief visit's nitrogen off-gassing requires the recompression schedule's time investment at the relief visit's frequency. The participant whose pre-enrollment screening identifies moderate confinement tolerance receives the daily surface tier transit that the standard therapeutic protocol's orientation session schedule provides as the minimum frequency for maintaining the therapeutic compliance within the psychological tolerance that the extended enrollment requires. The maximum therapeutic benefit and the psychological tolerances management are the protocol assignment's dual optimization objectives. The enrolled participant who cannot tolerate the therapeutic depth's continuous occupancy without the daily surface tier relief visit receives lower continuous exposure benefit than the saturation resident whose confinement tolerance allows the continuous therapeutic depth's occupancy. The protocol assignment's optimization balances the therapeutic benefit and the psychological tolerance within the individual enrolled participant's specific characteristics. The person-specific medicine that the founding charter's therapeutic philosophy requires as the clinical expression of the formation's specific therapeutic conditions offered to the specific individual's specific biological and psychological profile. What the galleries contain. The nitrox galleries contain more than the therapeutic atmosphere whose management the coordinating system's atmospheric management layer provides. They contain the civilization's daily life. The enrolled participants' research work in the Research Commons laboratory galleries, the therapeutic depths communal galleries' shared meals and governance participation, the residential galleries' personal accommodation and biological recovery, the educational galleries' cognitive engagement, and the social interactions that the permanent resident community's governance participation and the visiting researchers' collaborative engagements produce. Across the therapeutic zone's full inhabited extent, the civilization that lives inside the nitrox galleries is not the patient who has been admitted to the hyperbaric chamber for the clinical treatment session's duration, the passive recipient of the therapeutic protocol whose cooperation with the medical instruction is the therapeutic compliance that the clinical outcome requires. The civilization that lives inside the nitrox galleries is the self-governing community whose governance deliberations, scientific investigations, ecological management, and social interactions all occur within the therapeutic atmosphere that the formation's conditions and the coordinating system's management together produce as the environmental context of the community's entire daily existence. The therapeutic atmosphere is the civilization's air. The civilization breathes the therapeutic nitrox because the civilization lives where the therapeutic nitrox is. The civilization's biological response to the therapeutic nitrox is the civilization's biological response to its own environment. The distinction from the clinical patient's response to the clinical treatment's atmosphere is the distinction that the continuous exposure argument's foundational claim asserts as the therapeutic protocol's most significant innovation. The biological response to the environment in which the civilization lives is different in magnitude and in trajectory from the biological response to the treatment atmosphere that the clinical patient visits periodically and leaves. The civilization lives in the galleries. The galleries are the nitrox atmosphere. The nitrox atmosphere is the therapeutic environment. The therapeutic environment is the civilization's daily context. The daily context is what produces the biological response that the bloodwork measures. The bloodwork measures what the civilization's daily context produces. The civilization's health is the environment's expression. The environment is the formation's condition. The formation's condition is the civilization's management responsibility. The management responsibility is the founding charter's primary governance objective. The nitrox galleries are the founding charter's primary governance objective expressed as the therapeutic atmosphere that the civilization inhabits, not the aspiration toward a healthy environment, but the actual healthy environment, continuously maintained, continuously inhabited, continuously producing the biological response that the longitudinal dataset measures and the Research Commons publishes and the surface world scientific community evaluates. The galleries are what Pipe Dream is for. The atmosphere is what the formation provides. The biology is what responds. The response is what the civilization was built to produce. Cross-references. Part 2, CH4, the crystal tube standard. Part 6, CH2, scaphanders for everyone. Part 6, CH5, sleeping inside the aquifer. Part 8, Section A, CH4, from resort to municipality. Part 11, CH1, living under pressure. Part 11, CH3, telomere economics. Part 11, CH4, the Research Commons. Part 11, CH5, cognitive enhancement at depth. Part 10, CH4, The thermal architecture. For Atmospheric Management Layer Sensor Infrastructure Specification and CNS Oxygen Toxicity Monitoring Protocol, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4. Zone-Specific Nitrox Atmosphere Oxygen Fraction Management and Therapeutic Oxygen Partial Pressure Target Range Specification, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4. Transit Management Layer Decompression Schedule Enforcement and Individual Nitrogen Loading Calculation Protocol, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4. Gallery Design Aesthetic Provisions Specification and Natural Material Selection Criteria, see Appendix D, Construction Operations Manual. 4. Pre-enrollment Confinement Tolerance Screening Protocol and Protocol Assignment Confinement Management Individualization, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. Part 11. Medicine and Longevity. Chapter 3. Telomere Economics. The cell divides. The chromosome's tip is slightly shorter than it was before the division. The shortening is the replication problem's geometric consequence. The DNA polymerase that copies the chromosome cannot begin copying from the very end of the template strand, so each replication cycle leaves a small terminal sequence uncopied on the daughter chromosome. The uncopied sequence is the telomere's incremental erosion, the molecular clock that the cell biologist Leonard Hayflick empirically observed in the 1960s as the finite number of divisions that the human cell line undergoes before entering the permanent cell cycle arrest he called replicative senescence, the Hayflick limit. The Hayflick limit is not the organism's age. It is the cell's division history expressed as the telomere's current length, the molecular memory of how many times the cell's lineage has divided since the founding cell's full-length telomere established the division history's starting point. The telomere's current length is the distance remaining on the clock, the length between the current position and the critical minimum length below which the chromosome's structural integrity is compromised by the telomere's protective functions failure, the DNA damage responses activation, and the cell cycle arrest that the compromised chromosome's damage signal triggers. The biological age and the chronological age differ by the accumulated cellular division history. The individual whose cell division rate has been accelerated by the chronic inflammation, the oxidative stress, the telomere shortening viral infection, or the genetic predisposition toward faster replication has the telomere length of an individual older than their chronological age. The biological age that the cellular division history has produced running ahead of the chronological time that the calendar measures. The individual whose cell division rate has been moderated by the anti-inflammatory lifestyle, the oxidative stress reduction, and the genetic predisposition towards slower replication has the biological age that runs behind the chronological age. The telomere is the biological clock. The therapeutic pressure is the clock's rate modifier. The modification's economic value is what telomere economics measures. The economic argument. The surface world's healthcare system's most expensive patients are not the acutely ill, the patients whose single dramatic medical event consumes the emergency department's resources, the intensive care unit's technology, and the specialist's expertise for the event's resolution duration. The surface world's most expensive healthcare patients are the chronically ill, the individuals whose multiple chronic conditions accumulate across decades of biological age progression, each condition requiring the pharmaceutical management, the specialist monitoring, and the hospitalization that the condition's clinical management demands, at the cost that multiplies across the condition's simultaneous presence and the decade's cumulative duration. The chronic condition's economic model is the actuarial's most precisely characterized healthcare cost driver. The individual who develops the cardiovascular disease at 60, the type 2 diabetes at 65, the early cognitive decline at 70, and the musculoskeletal limitation at 75 has a healthcare cost trajectory that the actuarial model projects from the condition's onset to the individual's mortality at the statistical life expectancy for the multiple chronic conditions. Combined burden. The trajectory's total cost, the pharmaceutical management's annual cost multiplied by the decade of management before the next condition's onset, compounded across each successive condition's addition to the pharmaceutical and specialist management burden, is the chronic disease's economic argument for the investment in health span extension that prevents or delays the condition onset. The health span extension's economic argument is the comparison between the investment in the condition's prevention and the investment in the condition's management after onset. The individual who spends the enrollment period's investment at the therapeutic pressure before the cardiovascular disease's onset and achieves the 3-year delay in the onset's timing saves the healthcare system the 3 years of cardiovascular disease management, whose cost exceeds the enrollment period's investment cost by the ratio that the chronic condition's annual management cost and the enrollment period's investment cost together determine. The ratio's specific value is the telomere economics' most commercially significant calculation. If the chronic condition's annual management cost, the pharmaceutical, specialist, and hospitalization expenses that the cardiovascular disease's clinical management at the standard care level produces, is $20,000 per year, and the 3-year onset delay that the enrollment period's therapeutic effect produces saves $60,000 in management costs, and the enrollment period's investment cost is $50,000, the net economic benefit is $10,000. The investment's positive return that the health system's payer, the individual's personal finance, or the insurance company's actuarial calculation can all evaluate favorably. The favorable evaluation is the longevity program's economic arguments foundation, not the aspirational claim that the therapeutic pressure's biological effects will extend the enrolled participant's chronological lifespan by a specific number of years, but the conservative actuarial claim that the therapeutic pressure's documented reduction of the biological risk factors, the telomere shortening rate, the inflammatory marker level, and the cardiovascular efficiency indicator, produces the statistically measurable delay in the chronic condition's onset that the health economics literature has documented as the condition's preventable fraction. The longitudinal dataset's economic translation. The Research Commons longitudinal dataset's telomere length measurement at each enrolled participant's entry, monthly intervals, and exit produces the individual telomere extension rate during the enrollment period. The specific rate at which the enrolled participant's telomere length changed during the therapeutic exposure relative to the expected erosion rate at the enrolled participant's chronological age without the therapeutic intervention. The individual telomere extension rate is the enrollment's biological outcome at the molecular level whose economic translation requires the intermediate step of the telomere length's health outcomes mediation. The telomere length does not directly produce the economic benefit. The chronic condition's delayed onset produces the economic benefit. And the telomere length's chronic disease risk prediction is the mediation mechanism that connects the molecular outcome to the economic benefit. The mediation mechanism is the population genetics research's most robustly established finding in the telomere biology field. The individual whose telomere length is above the chronological age's population median has a statistically reduced risk of developing the cardiovascular disease, the type 2 diabetes, the neurodegenerative condition, and the musculoskeletal limitation at the chronological ages where the population median's telomere length individuals develop these conditions. The relative risk reduction, the ratio of the above median telomere individual's condition onset risk to the population median's condition onset risk, is the mediation mechanism's quantitative parameter that the epidemiological literature has measured in the large population cohort studies that have followed telomere length measurement and chronic condition onset across decades. The relative risk reduction is not the absolute guarantee that the enrollment period's therapeutic telomere extension prevents the chronic condition's onset for the specific enrolled participant. The individual's genetic risk, the surface world's environmental exposure history, and the chronic condition's multifactorial causation mean that the telomere length is one of many risk factors rather than the deterministic predictor of the individual's condition onset. The relative risk reduction is the population-level statistic that predicts the enrolled cohort's aggregate condition onset frequency, not the individual's outcome, but the group's average outcome that the health economic calculation uses. The health economic calculation's population-level prediction is the longevity program's commercial model's actuarial foundation. The enrolled cohort whose therapeutic telomere extension rate exceeds the chronological aging's expected erosion rate by the longitudinal dataset's measured magnitude will, on average, develop the chronic conditions at later chronological ages than the unenrolled comparison population at the relative risk reduction's magnitude. The later average onset, distributed across the enrolled cohort's individual variation in therapeutic response and in genetic and environmental risk, produces the aggregate healthcare cost reduction that the health economic calculation values as the program's economic benefit. The health economic calculation's uncertainty is the individual variation in therapeutic response, The enrolled cohort's longitudinal dataset shows the distribution of individual telomere extension rates, and the distribution's variance is as important as the distribution's mean for the health economic calculation's uncertainty quantification. The enrolled participant whose individual therapeutic response is at the distribution's lower tail produces a smaller economic benefit than the enrolled participant at the upper tail, and the health economic calculation must account for the full distribution's variance in the projected economic benefit range. The insurance model. The Surface World's health insurance system is the economic mechanism through which the population-level health risk is distributed across the insured pool. The individual whose actual health cost in any year is low subsidizes the individual whose actual health cost is high, and the pool's aggregate cost, the sum of all the insured individual's health costs, is distributed across the premium payments whose actuarial calculation reflects the pool's expected aggregate cost. The health insurance model's relationship to the longevity program is the actuarial question. Does the insurer's payer of the premium's enrolled participants' longevity program enrollment cost recover the cost from the premium reduction that the enrolled participants' reduced chronic condition risk produces in the actuarial calculation's expected lifetime healthcare cost? The actuarial question's answer depends on the longitudinal dataset's evidence at the temporal depth that the actuarial calculation requires, not the first-year telomere extension rate, whose short-term biological significance the Research Commons first publication establishes, but the decade scale and longer chronic condition onset delay, whose actuarial significance the health economic calculation requires to justify the insurance premium's longevity program enrollment cost. The decade scale evidence is not available in the founding installation's first years of operation. The actuarial question's definitive answer requires the longitudinal dataset's accumulation to the decade scale temporal depth that the chronic condition's onset delays measurement demands. The first years produce the biological mechanism's establishment and the short-term biomarkers improvement, the evidence that the therapeutic effect is biologically real and mechanistically plausible. The decade scale evidence produces the actuarial validation, the demonstration that the biologically real therapeutic effect translates into the actuarially significant chronic condition onset delay that the insurance model's economic justification requires. The decade scale evidence's accumulation is the longevity program's most commercially significant research program timeline. The insurance industry's actuarial adoption of the longevity program's enrollment cost as the insured premium's therapeutic investment requires the decade-scale chronic condition onset delays actuarial evidence that the founding installation's longitudinal dataset is accumulating with each year's enrolled cohort follow-up. The timeline's implication for the longevity program's commercial model evolution is the founding charter's most important economic strategic provision. The longevity program's commercial model in the founding years is the direct enrollment fee, the individual enrolled participant's out-of-pocket investment in the therapeutic exposure. The longevity program's commercial model in the decade-plus years, after the longitudinal dataset has accumulated the decade-scale evidence that the actuarial validation requires, is the insurance industry's reimbursement for the enrolled participants' enrollment cost as the preventive health investment whose chronic condition onset delay the actuarial calculation confirms as the insurance cost reduction that justifies the reimbursement. The commercial model evolution from out-of-pocket individual investment to insurance reimbursement is the longevity program's market scaling event. The out-of-pocket model limits the enrolled population to the individuals whose financial resources can support the enrollment cost without insurance reimbursement, a small, high-income population whose enrollment volume limits the longitudinal dataset's statistical power. The insurance reimbursement model opens the enrolled population to the full population whose health risk profile the actuarial calculation identifies as the chronic condition onset delays beneficiary. The large, economically diverse population whose enrollment volume produces the longitudinal dataset's statistical power that the actuarial validation requires. The market scaling event's timing is the decade-scale longitudinal evidence's accumulation rate. The founding installation's enrolled cohort's 10-year follow-up is the earliest date at which the insurance industry's actuarial adoption of the longevity program's cost as the preventive health investment can be supported by the enrolled cohort's chronic condition onset frequency in the follow-up period. The Commons economics of therapeutic benefit. The Founding Charter's Commons Ownership Principles application to the longevity program's therapeutic benefit is the Commons economics' most ethically significant provision. The therapeutic benefit that the formation's conditions produce is the formation's ecological gift, the pressure, the nitrox atmosphere, the temperature stability, the ecological environment. And the Founding Charter's governance philosophy specifies that access to the formation's ecological gift should not be exclusively reserved for the individuals whose financial resources enable the out-of-pocket enrollment cost. The Commons economics expression in the longevity program structure is the tiered enrollment model, the longevity program's full enrollment cost, the therapeutic depth's atmospheric management cost, the medical monitoring's blood work and clinical assessment cost, the residential accommodations operational cost, and the formation's maintenance costs enrollment periods allocation, is the program's economic floor whose break-even calculation the expansion reserves longevity program allocation must sustain. Above the economic floor, the longevity program's commercial pricing for the out-of-pocket enrollment covers the expansion reserve's investment return that the Founding Charter's economic architecture requires. The tiered model's Commons provision is the below-market enrollment subsidy. The Founding Charter's Commons governance protocol specifies that a fraction of the longevity program's capacity at each cenote installation is reserved for the enrolled participants whose enrollment cost is partially subsidized from the Research Commons scientific contributions licensing income and the expansion reserve's Commons allocation. The enrolled participants whose participation in the longitudinal dataset produces the statistical diversity that the Research Commons scientific validity requires, but whose financial resources cannot support the full out-of-pocket enrollment cost. The subsidy's rationale is simultaneously scientific and ethical. The longitudinal dataset whose enrolled population reflects only the high-income demographics' biological characteristics is the longitudinal dataset whose scientific generalizability to the full population's biological diversity is limited by the population's socioeconomic and genetic homogeneity. The therapeutic effects characterization across the full population's biological diversity requires the enrolled population's socioeconomic and genetic diversity that the subsidy's enrollment inclusion enables. The scientific requirement for the enrolled population's diversity is the ethical justification for the subsidy's Commons allocation, the scientific necessity that coincides with the ethical imperative. The coincidence is the Founding Charter's Commons economics' most elegant provision. The scientific requirement and the ethical requirement converge on the same programmatic provision, the enrolled population's diversity through the subsidy's inclusion. Because the formation's ecological gift and the Research Commons scientific validity are both most fully expressed in the population that reflects the human biological diversity that the formation's conditions would benefit across the full diversity's range. The telomere symbolic function. The telomere has become the longevity program's most widely recognized symbolic element in the surface world's popular science communication. The molecular clock whose length is the biological age's most precisely measurable indicator, whose shortening is the aging process's most directly observable molecular event, and whose extension by the therapeutic protocol's documented effect is the longevity program's most compelling single metric demonstration of the biological reality the founding installation's therapeutic claim represents. The telomere's symbolic function is not the Founding Charter's design. The telomere was the first biomarker that the founding installation's medical monitoring selected for the longitudinal dataset's primary outcome measure because the telomere length measurements, technical reliability at the cost and throughput that the longevity program's weekly blood work panel required was better established than the alternative aging biomarkers measurement at the same technical requirements. The telomere's symbolic function in the surface world's popular communication of the longevity program's therapeutic claim emerged from the scientific community's and the journalistic community's recognition that the telomere's molecular clock metaphor is the most accessible single-concept representation of the biological aging process that the surface world's popular science vocabulary has produced. The symbolic function is the longevity program's most valuable marketing asset. The enrolled participant who can show the blood work panel's telomere length measurement at enrollment and the comparison at the monthly intervals blood work, the direct visual evidence that the specific number has increased rather than decreased. is the enrolled participant who has the most personally compelling evidence of the therapeutic protocol's biological effect that the surface world's popular communication vocabulary can represent in a single data point. The single data point's communication power is disproportionate to its biological significance. The telomere lengths measurement at a single monthly intervals comparison is a noisy snapshot of the longitudinal trajectory whose biological significance requires the full enrollment period's trajectory assessment rather than the single comparison's direction. The telomere lengths measurement variation between any two time points includes the measurement's technical noise, the biological variation that the cell sampling's composition reflects, and the genuine biological trend that the therapeutic protocol's effect produces. And the single comparison's direction may reflect the technical noise or the biological variation more than the genuine biological trend, whose extraction requires the full longitudinal trajectory's statistical analysis. The founding charter's communication transparency requirement addresses the symbolic function's scientific overstatement risk. The longevity program's communication to enrolled participants and to the surface world's public must represent the telomeres measurement as a component of the longitudinal dataset's scientific assessment rather than as the personal proof of the therapeutic effect that the single comparison's favorable direction appears to provide. The single comparison's favorable direction is consistent with the therapeutic effect. The single comparison's favorable direction is not the therapeutic effect's confirmation in the individual. The confirmation requires the full enrollment period's longitudinal trajectory at the statistical significance level that the medical monitoring's assessment protocol specifies. The transparency requirement's practical expression is the blood work panel's communication format. The enrolled participant receives the blood work panel's results in the format that the coordinating system's medical monitoring layer produces as the longitudinal trajectory's current state, the current measurement alongside the enrollment period's full trajectory graph, with the statistical confidence interval that the trajectory's measurement uncertainty quantification provides, and the Terraform operator's clinical interpretation that contextualizes the current measurement's position within the trajectory's full biological significance. The current measurement is always in the context of the trajectory. The trajectory is always in the context of the population. The population is always in the context of the biological diversity. The biological diversity is always in the context of the formation that produced the therapeutic environment. The telomere is the formation's biological expression. The formation is 66 million years old. The telomere is the measure of what the formation does for the biology that inhabits it. The longevity program's scientific integrity. The longevity program's commercial success depends on the scientific integrity that the Research Commons publication record establishes as the therapeutic claims evidence base. The peer-reviewed publication of the longitudinal datasets analysis, the independent replication of the therapeutic effect in the second and third cenote installations enrolled cohorts, and the systematic review that the Research Commons collaborative scientific community produces as the evidence basis synthesis. For the health economic calculations actuarial application. The scientific integrity's vulnerability is the commercial pressure's influence on the publication record. The longevity program's commercial success creates the financial incentive to publish the longitudinal datasets analyses that show the therapeutic effect and to delay or suppress the analyses that show the therapeutic effect's absence or the adverse event's occurrence. The publication bias, the tendency to publish positive results and suppress negative results, is the surface world's medical literature's most persistent methodological problem, documented across the pharmaceutical industry's clinical trial literature as the pattern whose correction the clinical trial registration and the regulatory transparency requirements attempt to achieve. The Research Commons Publication Protocol's prevention of publication bias is the founding charter's scientific integrity's most specific provision. The Research Commons Publication Protocol requires the pre-registration of all planned longitudinal analyses in the Research Commons Public Study Registry before the analysis is conducted, and the publication of all registered analyses results in the Research Commons publication series regardless of the results' direction, favorable, unfavorable, or null. The mandatory publication requirement eliminates the selective publication that the commercial pressure's incentive would otherwise produce, as the publication bias. The mandatory publication requirement's most commercially challenging application is the adverse event report. The enrolled participant who experiences the decompression sickness event, the CNS oxygen toxicity seizure, or the confinement-related psychological crisis during the enrollment period is the adverse event whose documentation and publication in the Research Commons Adverse Event Registry the founding charter's transparency requirement specifies as the clinical practice's non-negotiable safety accountability. The adverse events publication alongside the therapeutic effects positive result publication is the scientific integrity's most concrete institutional expression. The safety and efficacy data's complete disclosure in the same public record that the surface world's scientific community and the health economic calculations actuarial assessment uses. The complete disclosure is the longevity program's most important commercial investment. The scientific credibility that the complete disclosure's transparency produces is more valuable to the longevity program's long-term commercial success than the adverse event suppression that the short-term commercial pressure might favor. The surface world's medical literature's history of selective publications' eventual exposure, the pharmaceutical trials whose suppressed adverse event data became the regulatory investigation subject, and the commercial disaster's cause, is the founding charter's cautionary reference for the transparency requirements' commercial justification. The transparency is the longevity program's most durable commercial asset. The scientific integrity is the transparency's institutional expression. The Research Commons Mandatory Publication Protocol is the scientific integrity's operational mechanism. The founding charter's provision of this mechanism as the non-negotiable governance standard is the longevity program's most important founding design decision. What telomere economics teaches. Telomere economics teaches the surface world's economic imagination something it has not previously been asked to assimilate. The biological age is an economic variable whose management produces measurable economic returns, and the return's magnitude justifies the investment in the biological mechanism's modification at the preventive intervention stage rather than at the chronic conditions management stage. This is not a novel concept in the surface world's public health economics. The vaccination's return on investment, the cancer screening's return on investment, and the smoking cessation's return on investment are all versions of the same economic argument. The preventive investment, whose upfront cost is justified by the averted management cost's actuarial value. The telomere extension's return on investment is the same argument's most molecular expression. The investment in the biological aging mechanism's modification, whose averted chronic condition onset's management cost exceeds the investment. The novelty is the mechanism's specificity. The vaccination prevents the specific infectious disease whose costs the actuarial calculation values. The telomere extension reduces the biological aging's rate across the full chronic condition risk spectrum, the cardiovascular disease, the metabolic disease, the neurodegenerative condition, and the musculoskeletal limitation, whose shared biological age risk factor the telomere length's chronic disease risk prediction reflects. The mechanism's breadth across the chronic condition spectrum is the telomere extension's most commercially significant property. The investment that reduces the risk across the full chronic condition spectrum produces the actuarial return across the full chronic condition management cost spectrum rather than the actuarial return across the single condition's management cost. The full spectrum return is the telomere economics' most important single claim, and it is the claim whose actuarial validation the decade-scale longitudinal evidence's accumulation must support. The enrolled cohort's 10-year follow-up must show not only the cardiovascular disease's onset delay, but the full chronic condition spectrum's onset delay. The evidence that the telomere extension's biological breadth produces the actuarial breadth that the economic argument requires for the insurance industry's full therapeutic investment justification. The decade-scale evidence is being accumulated. The enrolled cohort is aging. The chronic conditions will or will not develop at the rates the actuarial calculation requires to confirm the therapeutic effect's economic value. The confirmation will come when the evidence accumulates. The evidence accumulates when the enrolled cohort ages. The enrolled cohort ages in the formation. The formation provides the therapeutic environment. The therapeutic environment produces the biology. The biology determines the economics. The economics funds the formation's management. The formation's management maintains the therapeutic environment. The loop closes. Telomere economics is the closed loop's economic expression. The formation's investment in the therapeutic environment returns through the biology's response. The biology's response produces the economic value. The economic value funds the formation's management, and the managed formation continues to produce the therapeutic environment. The formation heals. The healing pays for the management. The management maintains the healing. The cycle is the civilization's economic foundation. Cross-references. Part 6, CH5, Sleeping Inside the Aquifer. Part 8, Section A, CH4, From Resort to Municipality. Part 8, Section A, CH5, The Economics of Infinite Expansion. Part 9, CH5, The Commons Ownership Principle. Part 11, CH1, Living Under Pressure. Part 11, CH2, The Nitrox Galleries. Part 11, CH4, The Research Commons. Part 11, CH5, Cognitive Enhancement at Depth. Part 11, CH6, The Longevity Principality. For longitudinal dataset telomere measurement protocol and biological age assessment specification, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. For mandatory publication protocol pre-registration requirement and adverse event reporting standard, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For tiered enrollment subsidy allocation protocol and commons enrollment fraction specification, see Appendix E, Economic Architecture, and Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For health economic calculation methodology and actuarial validation evidence standard for insurance reimbursement adoption, see Appendix E, Economic Architecture. Pipe Dream. Part 11, Medicine and Longevity. Chapter 4, The Research Commons. The surface world's biomedical research is organized around the scarcity of the things that biomedical research most requires: the patient population whose biology the study enrolls, the longitudinal duration whose temporal depth the biological mechanisms characterization demands, the cross-disciplinary expertise whose integration the complex biological systems understanding requires, and the data infrastructure whose commons architecture the scientific community's replication and extension depends on. Each of these is scarce in the surface world's research system not because the populations, the time, the expertise, and the data infrastructure do not exist, but because the incentive structures, the proprietary boundaries, and the institutional fragmentation that the surface world's research funding and organization produce make the specific populations, the specific temporal depths, the specific expertise combinations, and the specific data commons difficult to assemble and sustain within the single research program's budget and institutional scope. The pharmaceutical industry assembles the patient population through the clinical trials recruitment infrastructure, sustains the temporal depth through the trial's protocol duration, integrates the expertise through the contract research organization's multi-site coordination, and maintains the data infrastructure through the proprietary database whose access the regulatory submissions requirements specify. The result is the clinical trial, the largest and most expensive data generation mechanism in the surface world's biomedical research system, producing the evidence standard that the regulatory approval requires, at the cost that makes the pharmaceutical development's economic return the necessary condition for the research program's financial sustainability. The academic biomedical research assembles the patient population through the Institutional Review Board's approved protocol, sustains the temporal depth through the grant renewal cycle's continuity uncertainty, integrates the expertise through the collaboration's informal negotiation, and maintains the data infrastructure through the laboratory's locally managed repository. The result is the academic publication, the scientific insight that the smaller studies focused question produces, at the cost that the grant funding's competitive allocation supports, in the institutional silo whose data the collaboration's informal negotiation partially opens to the scientific community's access. The research commons is neither the clinical trial's proprietary assembly nor the academic silo's informal collaboration. It is the designed commons architecture whose specific provisions, the population's continuous enrollment, the temporal depth's longitudinal accumulation, the expertise's residential community, and the data infrastructure's constitutional commons status, address the specific scarcities that the surface world's research system has failed to resolve, because the scarcity's resolution requires the institutional design that the surface world's biomedical research funding and organization has not produced. The population assembly. The Longevity Program's enrolled population is the Research Commons' most distinctive resource, a population of individuals who have self-selected for the biological interest in the therapeutic pressures effects by completing the enrollment protocol, who are present in the formation's residential environment for the enrollment period's full duration, and who are providing the longitudinal biological data from the weekly Bloodworks biomarker panel as a condition of the enrollment's therapeutic access. The population self-selection is the research design's most significant methodological strength and its most significant epidemiological limitation simultaneously. The individuals who enroll in the longevity program are not a random sample of the human population whose health outcomes the Research Commons scientific program wishes to generalize to. They are the subset of the human population who can access the enrollment, the geographic, financial, and health eligibility criteria that the enrollment protocol specifies, and who choose to enroll, the motivation, the information, and the personal values that the enrollment decision requires. The self-selected population's biological characteristics may differ systematically from the general population's biological characteristics in ways that the Research Commons generalizability assessment must account for. The methodological strength is the compliance. The enrolled population's therapeutic exposure is the enrolled protocol's condition rather than the observational study's self-reported behavior that the compliance monitoring's absence leaves unverified. The enrolled participant who is present in the formation's therapeutic depth for the enrollment period's duration is actually receiving the therapeutic exposure that the protocol specifies. The compliance confirmation that the observational study's self-reported behavior cannot provide at the verification standard that the causal inferences attribution requires. The compliance's methodological significance is the Research Commons' most important study design advantage over the surface world's population-based observational cohort. The observational cohort whose exposure is the self-reported behavior rather than the monitored protocol compliance produces the exposure outcome association whose causal interpretation the unmeasured confounding's alternative explanation always threatens. The Research Commons enrolled cohort whose exposure is the monitored protocol compliance produces the association whose causal interpretation the protocol's design controls for the confounding that the compliance monitoring's absence leaves uncontrolled in the observational design. The population's longitudinal enrollment is the biological data's temporal depth accumulation mechanism, the same individuals providing the weekly bloodwork panel across the full enrollment period, the monthly clinical assessment across the full enrollment period, and the full duration's depth profile across the longitudinal record produces the within-individual temporal depth that the between-individual cross-sectional comparison cannot produce. The within-individual temporal depth, the same biological system observed across the therapeutic exposure's full duration, is the Research Commons' most scientifically distinctive data architecture element. The temporal depth. The longitudinal dataset's temporal depth is the Research Commons' most scientifically significant cumulative asset. The founding installation's enrolled cohort's 10-year follow-up produces the biological observation at the temporal depth that the chronic condition's onset delay characterization requires. And the 20-year follow-up produces the observation at the temporal depth that the actuarial validation's chronic condition onset frequency measurement demands. The temporal depth's accumulation rate is the enrolled cohort's continuity over time. The cohort that enrolled in the founding installation's first year and remains enrolled in the 20th year is the cohort whose 20-year temporal depth the Research Commons' 20-year longitudinal dataset reflects. The cohort attrition, the enrolled participants who discontinue the enrollment before the full protocol duration for the reasons that the dropout monitoring tracks, the personal circumstances, the health event, the financial constraints, and the preference change that the voluntary enrollment's discontinuation reflects, is the temporal depth's primary threat. The cohort attrition's management is the Research Commons' most operationally significant scientific program provision. The enrolled participant whose enrollment is interrupted by the surface world circumstances that the principality deal's external relationship accommodates, the professional obligation, the family event, the medical condition that the surface world's healthcare system must address, is the enrolled participant whose re-enrollment the protocol's continuation provision accommodates without the enrollment's complete discontinuation that the circumstances surface world requirement temporarily produces. The re-enrollment's temporal continuity in the longitudinal record requires the Research Commons data management protocol's most careful methodological handling. The gap in the therapeutic exposure during the surface world visits interval is a within-individual exposure interruption whose biological significance for the longitudinal trajectory's causal interpretation the research commons analytical methods must address, rather than ignore. The interrupted time series analysis, the statistical method that the epidemiology and the biostatistics have developed for the analysis of the longitudinal exposure's interruption, is the Research Commons publication standard for the re-enrolled participants' interrupted longitudinal record. The 20-year longitudinal dataset's temporal depth at the founding installation is the biological observation's scientific significance at the scale that the surface world's aging science has not previously produced in a single cohort under the controlled conditions that the enrollment protocol's compliance monitoring provides. The Framingham Heart Study's multi-decade follow-up is the surface world's most comparable longitudinal cohort, but the Framingham cohort's exposure, the community's lifestyle and environmental conditions in the Massachusetts towns whose residents volunteered for the study's follow-up, is the observational design's uncontrolled exposure rather than the Research Commons monitored therapeutic protocol. The temporal depth at the controlled compliance's research design is the Research Commons' unique position in the aging sciences empirical evidence base. The expertise integration. The Research Commons residential community is the expertise integration's most distinctive mechanism, the cross-disciplinary scientific program whose geological scientists, biological ecologists, medical researchers, engineers, governance scholars, and legal researchers all inhabit the same formation's residential environment, share the same communal gallery's daily interactions, and participate in the same Redeemer framework's governance deliberations, produces the informal intellectual exchange that the surface world's research university's departmental silo organization systematically prevents. The informal intellectual exchange is the interdisciplinary insight's primary generation mechanism, the geological scientist whose morning monitoring review discusses the halocline depth's current position with the medical researcher whose enrolled participants' therapeutic depth assignment, the halocline's position effects, produces the geological medical dialogue that the formation's specific conditions require for the therapeutic protocol's depth assignments, geological condition dependence, to be explicitly integrated into the medical monitoring's clinical assessment. The dialogue happens because the geological scientist and the medical researcher share the communal gallery's breakfast and the formation's daily conditions joint professional engagement, not because the research program's formal protocols specified the cross-disciplinary consultation. The informal exchange's institutional protection is the Research Commons governance provision. The Redeemer Framework's Research Commons governance protocol specifies the Research Commons publication peer review process as the institutional mechanism through which the informal interdisciplinary dialogue's insights receive the formal scientific community's evaluation. The informal insight that the communal gallery's breakfast produces becomes the Research Commons publication when the insight's formalization as the scientific hypothesis, the evidence assessment, and the analytical methodology produces the submission that the peer review's evaluation confirms as the scientific community's publication standards meeting. The publication peer review's cross-disciplinary composition is the Research Commons' most institutionally distinctive peer review format. The submission that addresses the geological condition's medical significance requires the geological sciences peer reviewer and the medical sciences peer reviewer simultaneously, and the Research Commons publication standard requires both disciplines review rather than the single disciplines review that the surface world's disciplinary journals standard specifies. The cross-disciplinary peer review is the Research Commons publication quality standards expression of the interdisciplinary insight's scientific validation requirement. The insight that bridges two disciplines requires both disciplines' peer review to confirm that the bridge is scientifically sound at both endpoints. The residential expertise integration's most productive outcome category is the observation that the single discipline specialist would not have made. The medical researcher who has not spent the morning reviewing the geological monitoring data with a Terraform operator does not notice that the halocline's unusual depth on the bloodwork collection day correlates with the enrolled cohort's bloodwork results' unusual distribution on that specific day. The joint observation, the geological specialist's morning monitoring data and the medical researcher's bloodwork distribution's unusual pattern on the same day, is the Research Commons' most distinctive scientific signal. The formation's conditions biological expression that neither the geologist alone nor the medical researcher alone would have detected as the investigation's starting point. The data commons. The Research Commons data infrastructure is the most technically complex and most institutionally significant component of the Research Commons design. The Commons govern database architecture whose specific provisions, the data accessibility, the data privacy, the data integrity, and the data standards, together constitute the data commons that the surface world scientific community accesses as the most comprehensive longitudinal biological dataset in the aging sciences empirical evidence base. The Data Accessibility's Commons specification is the most commercially sensitive provision. The data that the longevity program's enrolled participants contribute to the longitudinal dataset is the Research Commons' most valuable commons asset, and the specification of who can access the data, at what aggregation level, for what purpose, and under what terms is the Commons governance protocol's most consequential economic and scientific decision. The access level specification reflects the data privacy's protection requirement, the individual enrolled participants' identifiable biological data, the specific bloodwork results linked to the specific individual's identity, is the private health information whose disclosure the Principality's medical privacy governance specifies as the enrolled participant's personal information right. The Research Commons data accessibility does not include the individually identifiable data's access. The scientific community's access is to the de-identified, aggregated, and statistically analyzed data whose presentation prevents the individual re-identification that the medical privacy governance prohibits. The de-identification's technical implementation is the data commons' most privacy-sensitive engineering provision. The statistical disclosure limitation techniques, the cell suppression, the data perturbation, and the synthetic data generation that the de-identification protocol applies to the individual data before the Research Commons public access produce the dataset whose statistical properties support the scientific analysis, but whose individual data reconstruction the data. Identification has made computationally infeasible within the privacy protections required assurance level. The Data Integrity's Commons specification is the tamper evidence provision that the Research Commons scientific credibility requires. The longitudinal dataset's historical record, the enrolled cohort's biological measurements across the full enrollment period, must be tamper evident at the same standard that the Digital Twins Commons Governance Archive requires for the Formation Intelligence Records legal documentation. The blockchain analog integrity verification that the Data Commons technical infrastructure implements produces the cryptographic proof that the historical data has not been modified since the original collection's timestamp. The scientific community's assurance that the data they access is the data that the Research Commons collection protocol produced rather than the data that the commercial pressure's incentive might have modified toward the favorable result. The data standard specification is the Research Commons interoperability provision, the biomarker measurements standard protocol, the sample handling's standard procedure, and the data format's standard structure that the Research Commons data collection standard specifies across all Cenote installations enrolled cohorts produces the dataset whose individual Cenote installations data can be combined in the multi-site analysis that the statistical powers requirements demand for the rarest outcomes detection and the individual variations characterization. The multi-site analysis's statistical power is the Research Commons' most important scientific capability. The single Cenote installation's enrolled cohort, whose size the formation's capacity limits, is the data source that the common outcomes analysis requires at the significance level the publication standard specifies, but the rare outcomes analysis, the specific chronic conditions onset, whose population frequency is low enough that the single Cenote's enrolled cohort does not produce the statistical power the rare events detection requires, demands the multi-site analysis whose combined cohort size the regional network's full enrolled population provides. The research program's priority setting. The Research Commons Annual Strategic Review is the governance mechanism through which the permanent resident community's collective judgment about the scientific program's priority allocation is formed and expressed as the research program's resource allocation for the next year's investigations. The priority settings inputs are the Research Commons current evidence base, the scientific community's external engagement with the published findings, the pharmaceutical licensing pipeline's development priorities, and the longevity program's enrolled population's biological findings emerging patterns. Together, these inputs constitute the priority assessment's informational foundation that the Governance Council's Research Commons Committee reviews in a strategic reviews preparation period. The priority allocations output is the research program's resource deployment, the coordinating system's scientific computing allocation, the Research Commons laboratory gallery's equipment priority, the Terraform operator's time allocation to the formation science versus the medical research interface functions, and the visiting researcher fellowship selection criteria that the Research Commons annual invitation for the external scientific community's residential research access specifies. The Visiting Researcher Fellowship is the Research Commons' most important external engagement provision. The invitation to the external scientific community's researchers whose specific expertise complements the Research Commons' resident expertise in the scientific investigation that the priority assessment has identified as the program's next most important frontier produces the external validation and the expertise supplementation that the residential community's self-contained expertise cannot provide when the research frontier crosses into the disciplinary specialization that no current permanent resident represents. The visiting researcher's residential integration is the fellowship's most productive provision. The external researcher who spends the fellowship duration in the formation's residential environment, sharing the communal gallery's daily interactions with the permanent residents, participating in the Redeemer Framework's governance deliberations as the invited observer, and contributing the external expertise's perspective to the research program's current investigations produces the insight. Integration that the temporary visit's intellectual engagement and the permanent community's context knowledge together enable. The Visiting Researcher Fellowship selection criteria's most distinctive requirement is the interdisciplinary orientation. The external researcher whose single discipline's expertise cannot engage with the formation's cross-disciplinary research environment without the intellectual flexibility that the interdisciplinary orientation requires is not the visiting researcher whose fellowship will be most productive. The visiting researcher whose disciplinary expertise is deep and whose cross-disciplinary orientation is genuine, whose training and publication records show the ability to engage with adjacent disciplines' methods, findings, and conceptual frameworks, is the researcher whose fellowship produces the intellectual bridging that the Research Commons residential community's expertise complementation requires. The Research Commons Scientific Legacy. The Research Commons scientific legacy is being written in the longitudinal dataset whose current accumulation is the first 100 pages of the 1,000-page scientific document that the 1,000-year design life will produce. The biological observation of the human physiology's response to the therapeutic pressure's continuous exposure across the full temporal depth that the enrollment period's generation-spanning continuity eventually produces. The first 100 pages are the telomere extension rates characterization, the inflammatory markers reductions mechanism investigation, and the cardiovascular efficiency enhancements pathway analysis, the founding biological effects whose existence the first enrolled cohort's data has established, and whose mechanisms the research program's cross-disciplinary expertise is actively characterizing. The next 100 pages, the decade-scale actuarial validation, the rare conditions onset characterization, and the saturation residency's extreme long-term biological trajectory are being written as the founding cohort's decade-scale follow-up accumulates and the saturation residence biological monitoring continues its longitudinal documentation. The final pages, the generational biological trajectory, the epigenetic inheritance's characterization in the formation-born children, and the century-scale biological evolution that the formation's conditions may produce in the population that inhabits them across multiple generations, will not be written in any founding generation's scientific career. They will be written by the researchers that the foundation-born children's children will become, studying the biological characteristics of their own community's multi-generational formation habitation as the scientific program whose founding generation established the methods, the infrastructure, and the commons governance that the generational continuity requires. The Research Commons scientific legacy is the scientific program that is longer than any individual researcher's career, deeper than any single discipline scope, and more consequential for the surface world's understanding of human biology in varied environmental conditions than any comparable scientific program has previously produced. The formation is the laboratory. The civilization is the cohort. The 1,000 years is the follow-up. The Research Commons is the institutional structure that makes the follow-up survive the century beyond any individual researcher, the institution beyond any funding cycle, and the commons beyond any commercial pressure's privatization attempt. The scientific legacy is what the founding charter specified the research commons to produce. The research commons is producing it. The production takes 1,000 years. The first 100 pages are remarkable. The completed document will be the most important longitudinal biological study in the surface world's scientific history. The civilization is writing it by living inside the formation. The research commons is the pen. Cross-references. Part 1, CH5, Tourism as Infrastructure. Part 8, Section A, CH4, From Resort to Municipality. Part 9, CH4, Redeemer as Governance OS. Part 9, CH5, The Commons Ownership Principle. Part 10, CH6, ESI as Co-Creating Partner. Part 11, CH1, Living Under Pressure. Part 11, CH3, Telomere Economics. Part 11, CH5, Cognitive Enhancement at Depth. Part 11, CH6, The Longevity Principality. Part 12, CH6, Why Pipe Dream Changed Everything. For Research Commons publication peer review cross-disciplinary standard and mandatory publication protocol specification. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Data Commons de-identification technical protocol and statistical disclosure limitation specification. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Visiting Researcher Fellowship Selection Criteria and Interdisciplinary Orientation Assessment Standard. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Annual Strategic Review Priority Assessment Process and Research Program Resource Allocation Governance Protocol. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Data Commons Blockchain Analog Integrity Verification Technical Specification and Tamper Evidence Standard. See Appendix G, Formation Intelligence Record. Pipe Dream. Part 11, Medicine and Longevity. Chapter 5, Cognitive Enhancement at Depth. The surface world's cognitive enhancement industry is built on the premise that the brain's performance can be improved by adding something to it. The nootropic supplement that the consumer purchases from the online vendor, the prescription stimulant that the student acquires from the diverted prescription, the transcranial direct current stimulation device that the biohacker assembles from the consumer electronics components, and the meditation application that the productivity optimization community promotes as the attention management's most accessible intervention. The adding something ranges from the pharmacological molecules that modulate the neurotransmitter's concentration, the receptor's sensitivity, or the enzyme's activity, to the electrical current that shifts the cortical excitability of the brain regions whose function the enhancement target specifies, to the behavioral practices that the learning sciences evidence base identifies as the cognitive performance's reliable correlates. The adding something's results are modest across every enhancement category that the controlled trial's evidence base has examined with the methodological rigor that the causal inference requires. The double-blind, placebo-controlled trial whose primary outcome is the cognitive performance's objective measurement rather than the subjective report that the placebo response's magnitude inflates routinely produces the enhancement effect whose statistical significance at the population level is real, but whose practical significance at the individual's daily cognitive performance level is small enough that the double-blind design is necessary to distinguish it from the placebo response. The cognitive enhancement at depth is not built on the premise that something added to the brain improves it. It is built on the premise that the environment's specific conditions, the therapeutic pressure, the nitrox atmosphere's oxygen partial pressure, the formation's sensory richness, and the residential community's intellectual engagement constitute the brain's operating context, and that the operating context-specific character at the cenote formation's therapeutic depth produces the brain's cognitive performance at the level that the context-specific conditions enable rather than at the diminished level that the surface world's context produces. The distinction is not semantic. The surface world's cognitive enhancement adds something to the brain in the environment where the brain's performance is already reduced by the chronic inflammation, the oxidative stress, the sleep quality's disruption, the social isolation's neurological effect, and the sensory monotony's cognitive underengagement that the surface world's environmental conditions systematically produce in the modern urban population's biological experience. The depth's cognitive enhancement removes the reducing conditions and replaces them with the conditions that the brain's performance optimizes within, not adding to the brain, but removing what the environment was taking away. The inflammation-cognition connection. The connection between the chronic inflammation's biological state and the cognitive performance's functional level is the surface world's cognitive neuroscience research's most robustly replicated finding across the past 2 decades of investigation. The inflammatory cytokines elevation in the peripheral blood, the CRP, the IL-6, the TNF-alpha, whose reduction the therapeutic pressure's anti-inflammatory effect produces, corresponds with the cognitive performance's reduction in the domains of executive function, processing speed, and episodic memory across the population studies that have measured both the inflammatory biomarker and the cognitive performance assessment in the same individuals at the same time points. The correspondence is not the random association that the statistical test's significance calculation might produce from the multiple comparisons that the large epidemiological datasets variable combinations generate. The correspondence has the mechanistic plausibility that the biological pathways research supports as the causal hypothesis. The inflammatory cytokine that the peripheral blood measurement detects does not stay in the periphery. The blood-brain barrier's cytokine transport mechanisms, the vagal nerve's inflammatory signal transmission, and the brain's own resident immune cells, the microglia's activation in response to the peripheral inflammatory signal all provide the pathways through which the peripheral inflammation's biological state reaches the brain's neurological environment and produces the neuroinflammation whose downstream effects on the synaptic transmission, the neuroplasticity, and the neurotransmitter systems function the cognitive neurosciences mechanistic research has begun to characterize. The therapeutic pressure's anti-inflammatory effect is therefore the cognitive enhancement's most mechanistically direct pathway. The enrolled participant whose inflammatory marker panel shows the therapeutic pressure's reduction of the CRP, IL-6, and TNF-alpha from the enrollment baseline levels to the therapeutic depths maintained lower levels is the enrolled participant whose neuroinflammation's reduction the peripheral inflammatory markers reduction predicts, the biological state whose neurological effect the Research Commons Cognitive Assessment Protocol monitors as the enrolled cohort's cognitive trajectory across the enrollment period. The cognitive trajectory's measurement is the Research Commons' most methodologically demanding assessment. The cognitive performance's test-retest reliability, the correlation between the same individual's cognitive assessment at 2 time points in the absence of any genuine cognitive change, is the cognitive measurement's most important psychometric property for the longitudinal study's trajectory assessment. The cognitive assessment tool whose test-retest reliability is low produces the trajectory assessment whose noise exceeds the genuine cognitive changes signal, making the therapeutic effects detection in the longitudinal data statistically impossible regardless of the therapeutic effect's actual biological magnitude. The Research Commons Cognitive Assessment Protocol's tool selection criteria specify the test-retest reliability above the minimum threshold that the detection power calculation requires for the enrolled cohort size and the expected cognitive effects magnitude at the enrollment period's duration. The tools that meet the threshold, the specific neuropsychological tests whose test-retest reliability the surface world's normative database establishes at the required level, are the Research Commons Cognitive Assessment Protocol's standard battery, applied at the enrollment, monthly, and exit assessment intervals that the longitudinal trajectory's slope estimation requires. The oxygen delivery and cognitive performance. The brain is the most metabolically demanding organ in the human body per unit of tissue volume. The 3-pound brain that constitutes approximately 2% of the adult body's mass consumes approximately 20% of the body's total oxygen and glucose at rest. And the specific neural circuit's active engagement during the cognitive task's performance increases the local metabolic demand above the resting baseline by the amount that the functional neuroimaging's blood oxygenation level-dependent signal reflects as the cognitive task-related brain activity's metabolic signature. The metabolic demand's oxygen supply is the cerebrovascular system's function, the arterial oxygen content, the dissolved oxygen and the hemoglobin-bound oxygen that the arterial blood carries to the brain's capillary bed, and the cerebral blood flow, the volume of arterial blood delivered to the brain per unit time, together determine the brain's oxygen supply rate. The oxygen supply rate minus the oxygen consumption rate equals the net oxygen balance at the neural tissue level whose adequacy the cellular respiration's aerobic capacity requires for the ADP production that the sodium-potassium pump's maintenance of the electrochemical gradient that the action potential's generation depends on. The therapeutic pressure's dissolved oxygen delivery enhancement is the cognitive oxygen supply's most direct physiological effect. The nitrox atmosphere's therapeutic oxygen partial pressure increases the dissolved oxygen in the arterial blood above the surface world's 21% oxygen fractions dissolved oxygen contribution, providing the arterial blood's additional dissolved oxygen that the hemoglobin's binding capacity's saturation at the surface world's oxygen partial pressure does not allow the additional delivery of. The additional dissolved oxygen is available to the neural tissue's mitochondrial respiration without the hemoglobin's binding and unbinding cycles oxygen extraction efficiency's limitation. The dissolved oxygen's additional delivery to the neural tissue is most significant during the cognitive task's performance when the local metabolic demand exceeds the resting baseline and the oxygen supply-demand balance approaches the constraint that the arterial oxygen delivery's rate imposes. The cognitive task's performance at the therapeutic depth's enhanced dissolved oxygen delivery occurs in the biological context, where the oxygen supply's enhanced rate relieves the supply-demand constraint that the surface world's atmospheric oxygen partial pressure's supply rate would impose at the same cognitive demand level. The cognitive performance at the supply-demand constraints relief is the cognitive enhancement's most physiologically specific mechanism. The cognitive tasks whose execution demands the highest local metabolic rate in the brain regions whose function the task recruits, the executive function tasks that the prefrontal cortex's sustained activation requires, the working memory tasks that the parietal frontal network's high metabolic demand sustains, the processing speed tasks that the distributed neural network's rapid parallel processing demands, are the tasks where the oxygen supply-demand constraints relief at the therapeutic depth produces the most pronounced cognitive performance enhancement relative to the surface world's oxygen partial pressure supply. The sleep architecture depth effect. The brain's consolidation of the day's learning into the long-term memory representations that the hippocampal cortical consolidation process produces occurs primarily during the slow-wave sleep phase whose adequate duration and depth is the cognitive performance's single most important environmental prerequisite. The sleep architecture's slow-wave phase duration and depth, the amount of time spent in the Stage 3 and Stage 4 NREM sleep that the polysomnography identifies as the slow-wave sleep's electrophysiological signature, is the individual's most reliable cognitive performance predictor across the learning sciences' experimental evidence base. The therapeutic pressure's sleep architecture effect, documented in the residential accommodation chapter's medical monitoring data as the slow-wave phase's extended duration at the therapeutic depth relative to the surface world's 1.0 atmosphere sleep architecture, is the cognitive enhancement's most mechanistically important pathway. The extended slow-wave phase duration at the therapeutic depth produces the hippocampal memory consolidation's more complete execution across each sleep cycle, whose cognitive performance expression the Research Commons longitudinal assessment monitors as the episodic memory's enrollment period trajectory. The episodic memory trajectory, the enrolled participants' memory for the episodes, the events, and the autobiographical information that the daily life at the therapeutic depth produces, is the Research Commons Cognitive Assessment Protocol's most sensitive longitudinal indicator because the episodic memory's consolidation is the slow-wave sleep phase's most well-characterized cognitive function, and the therapeutic depth's sleep architecture effect is the most directly measurable sleep quality metric that the cognitive outcomes trajectory correlates with. The slow-wave phase's extension at the therapeutic depth is not unlimited. The biological sleep architecture's slow-wave phases proportion is genetically constrained within the individual variation that the population's sleep architecture research documents, and the therapeutic depth's pressure effect on the slow-wave phase's duration operates within the individual's genetic constraint range rather than transcending the biological limit. The cognitive enhancement from the sleep architecture's improvement is therefore bounded by the individual's genetic sleep architecture ceiling, the maximum slow-wave phase proportion that the individual's biological sleep regulatory system allows regardless of the environmental condition. The bounded enhancement is the cognitive enhancement at depth's most important realistic characterization, not the unlimited cognitive performance improvement that the adding something paradigm's marketing often implies, but the restoration to the individual's genetic ceiling from the surface world sleep disruptions reduction below the ceiling. The therapeutic depths sleep architecture improvement brings the enrolled participant's actual sleep architecture toward the individual's genetic potential rather than beyond it, the restoration rather than the transcendence. The sensory environment's cognitive stimulation. The formation's sensory environment is the cognitive enhancement's least quantifiable and most pervasively influential pathway. The specific sensory character of the inhabited geological formation, the visual complexity of the biological community through the transparent hull, the acoustic richness of the cenote's underwater soundscape transmitted through the hull material, the proprioceptive and vestibular stimulation of the Scaphandar session's three-dimensional aquatic movement, and the thermal sensory engagement of the formation's temperature gradient constitutes the daily sensory input whose novelty, complexity, and biological relevance the cognitive neurosciences environmental enrichment research identifies as the neuroplasticity's most consistent stimulator in the free-living human population. The environmental enrichment literature's most replicated finding is the cognitive reserves accumulation in a sensory-rich and cognitively demanding environment. The individual who spends their years in a sensory-rich and cognitively complex environment, the multilingual household, the intellectually stimulating professional environment, the socially engaged community, accumulates the cognitive reserve that the aging's neurobiological process reduces at a slower rate than the sensory, impoverished and cognitively monotonous environment's contribution to the individual's biological aging trajectory. The formation's sensory environment is the most extreme expression of the environmental enrichment that the cognitive reserve literature has studied, not the urban environment's social complexity, which the cognitive reserve literature's primary study context provides, but the geological formation's sensory novelty. The daily visual encounter with the biological community through the transparent hull's specific optical distance, the acoustic encounter with the cenote's underwater soundscape, whose specific frequency spectrum the human auditory system has not evolved to habitually process, and the proprioceptive encounter with the neutral buoyancy's three-dimensional freedom that the Scaphandar session's aquatic environment produces. The sensory novelty is the cognitive stimulation's most effective driver when the novelty is accompanied by the biological meaning that the expertise's development produces. The enrolled participant who has studied the biological community's species composition and ecological succession dynamics encounters the hull's visual field as the biological meaning's expression. The succession stage that the window fish's cleaning pattern reveals, the Bodo's behavioral state that the acoustic signature's pattern indicates, rather than the visually complex but semantically empty scene that the naive observer encounters without the expertise's interpretive framework. The expertise's development is therefore the cognitive enhancement's most important long-term trajectory determinant. The enrolled participant who invests the enrollment period in developing the formation's ecological expertise, whose daily engagement with the formation sciences learning accumulates the interpretive framework that converts the sensory input into the biological meaning, is the enrolled participant whose cognitive stimulation's biological effect compounds with the expertise's development rather than habituating to the sensory input's novelty, as the habituation reduces the novelty's stimulation below the neuroplasticity's threshold. The social cognitive environment. The permanent resident community's intellectual engagement is the cognitive enhancement's most socially mediated pathway. The daily interactions in the communal gallery, the research commons collaborative investigations, the Redeemer framework's governance deliberations, and the Terraform operator's formation monitoring's professional discourse constitute the social cognitive environment whose intellectual richness is the cognitive enhancement's social dimension. The social cognitive environment's cognitive enhancement pathway is the fluid intelligence's maintenance. The fluid intelligence, the reasoning ability that the novel problem solution requires without the crystallized knowledge's application, is the cognitive ability that the aging's neurobiological process reduces most consistently across the population's longitudinal cognitive trajectories. And the social cognitive environment's intellectually demanding interactions are the fluid intelligence's most consistent maintenance mechanism in the aging literature's evidence base. The permanent resident community's intellectual diversity is the social cognitive environment's most important cognitive maintenance provision. The community whose members represent the geological science, the biological ecology, the medical research, the engineering, the governance scholarship, and the legal expertise provides the intellectually diverse social environment whose cognitive demands in the cross-disciplinary interactions are the fluid intelligence's most effective maintenance. Stimulus. The demands that require the novel synthesis rather than the familiar patterns application that the single-discipline community's interactions predominantly produce. The governance deliberation's cognitive demand is the social cognitive environment's most distinctive cognitive requirement. The Redeemer framework's deliberative processes information disclosure, the concurrent authorizations formation condition assessment, and the conflict resolution mechanisms principled reasoning require the cognitive abilities, the working memory, the executive function, the reasoning, and the perspective taking that the governance participation exercise in the complex, high-stakes, multi-perspective deliberative context that the surface world's comparable cognitive demand requires in the professional contexts whose complexity and stakes the cenote installation's governance equals. The governance participation's cognitive maintenance effect is the research commons' most societally significant cognitive finding. The permanent resident, whose governance participation in the Redeemer framework's deliberative processes provides the fluid intelligence's high-stakes complex reasoning demand across the full enrollment period's duration, is the permanent resident whose cognitive trajectory the longitudinal dataset should show the most favorable cognitive maintenance relative to the enrolled participant whose therapeutic exposure occurs without the comparable governance participation's cognitive demand. The research design that isolates the governance participation's cognitive maintenance contribution from the therapeutic pressures, anti-inflammatory, and oxygen delivery contributions is the research commons' most methodologically challenging investigation. The confounding between the governance participation and the enrollment duration, the depth assignment, and the residential community's social engagement makes the partial isolation of the governance participation's specific contribution the analysis that the careful statistical design and the Terraform operator's formation monitoring data must carefully address. The cognitive enhancement's limits and ethics. The cognitive enhancement at depth's limits are the biological limits that the therapeutic mechanism's specific pathways specify. The anti-inflammatory effect's cognitive benefit is bounded by the baseline inflammation's contribution to the cognitive performance's reduction before enrollment. The enrolled participant whose baseline inflammatory markers are within the surface world's normal reference range may not show the cognitive enhancement that the enrolled participant whose baseline inflammation is elevated above the reference range shows, because the enhancement's magnitude is proportional to the burden that the anti-inflammatory effect relieves. The oxygen delivery enhancement's cognitive benefit is bounded by the baseline cerebrovascular function's capacity to utilize the enhanced dissolved oxygen delivery. The enrolled participant whose cerebrovascular function is fully adequate for the surface world's oxygen partial pressures delivery at the resting and cognitive task metabolic rates may not show the processing speed enhancement that the enrolled participant whose cerebrovascular function's marginal adequacy is relieved by the enhanced delivery shows. The sleep architecture improvement's cognitive benefit is bounded by the individual's genetic sleep architecture ceiling, the maximum slow-wave phase proportion that the biological sleep regulatory system allows regardless of the environmental condition. The sensory environment's cognitive stimulation is bounded by the habituation that the sustained exposure produces when the expertise's development has exhausted the sensory novelty's unreached biological meaning. The enrolled participant whose formation expertise has reached the saturation level, where the daily sensory input's biological meaning is fully extracted without the novel synthesis that the continuing expertise's development requires. The limits are the cognitive enhancement's honest characterization, not the unlimited cognitive performance improvement that the adding something paradigm's marketing rhetoric implies, but the specific cognitive benefit that the specific therapeutic mechanism's relief of the specific cognitive burden produces within the specific individual's biological constraints. The ethics are the cognitive enhancement's honest specification. The Research Commons transparency requirement specifies that the cognitive assessment protocol's findings, the favorable cognitive trajectory and the neutral or unfavorable trajectory, are published in the mandatory publication protocol's full disclosure. The enrolled participant who does not show the cognitive enhancement's expected trajectory is the enrolled participant whose finding the Research Commons publishes alongside the enrolled participant who shows the expected trajectory. The scientific credibility that the mandatory publication produces is the ethical foundation on which the longevity program's cognitive enhancement claim rests, the claim that is only as credible as the evidence whose full disclosure the scientific community's critical evaluation requires. The cognitive enhancement at depth is real within the limits the biology specifies and the evidence establishes. The evidence establishes what it establishes. The limits bound what the biology allows. The honest characterization is the ethics expression. The expression is the founding charter's transparency requirements, institutional protection. The cognitive depth's civilizational significance. The civilization that inhabits the geological formation produces in its permanent residence the specific cognitive profile that the formation's conditions and the residential community's intellectual engagement together generate across the enrollment period's accumulation. The anti-inflammatory biology's cognitive support, the enhanced oxygen delivery's processing capacity, the sleep architecture's memory consolidation optimization, the sensory environment's expertise-driven cognitive stimulation, and the social cognitive environment's governance participation and cross-disciplinary collaboration. This cognitive profile is not the surface world's consumer's nootropic supplement's modest enhancement of the brain that the surface world's environment systematically burdens. It is the brain that the formation's specific conditions have supported toward the biological performance that the specific individual's genetic endowment allows in the optimal environmental context that the formation's therapeutic conditions produce. The civilization whose members' cognitive profiles reflect the formation's specific conditions is a civilization whose collective intelligence, the aggregate of the individual cognitive performances in the governance deliberations, the research investigations, the ecological management decisions, and the legal strategies, long horizon planning, reflects the formation's cognitive gift as much as the individual's biological endowment. The civilization's collective intelligence is the formation's environmental intelligence expressed in the human community that inhabits the formation in the conditions that the therapeutic pressure, the anti-inflammatory biology, the sleep architecture, and the sensory environment together constitute as the cognitive enhancement's environmental provision. The formation enhances the civilization's cognition by providing the conditions that the cognition's biological optimization requires. The civilization manages the formation by applying the optimized cognition that the formation provides. The formation and the civilization enhance each other. The formation's management quality benefits from the cognitive optimization, and the cognitive optimization benefits from the formation's managed conditions. The mutual enhancement is the co-creation's cognitive dimension. The formation's geological character and the civilization's cognitive profile are co-creating each other across the design life's temporal span. Each generation's formation management shaping the next generation's cognitive development in the conditions that the previous generation's management has maintained, and each generation's cognitive performance shaping the next generation's formation management in the intellectual quality that the previous generation's cognitive environment has developed. The geological formation is the cognitive environment. The cognitive environment is the civilization's intellectual foundation. The intellectual foundation is the civilization's most durable competitive advantage, not the mineral harvest's commercial return, not the pharmaceutical secondary metabolites' licensing income, not the longevity program's enrollment fee. The cognitive depth that the formation's conditions produce in the civilization that inhabits it is the civilization's most valuable long-term asset. The intellectual capacity to understand the formation well enough to manage it correctly for the 1,000 years that the correct management requires. The formation gave the civilization the cognitive capacity to understand the formation. The civilization used the cognitive capacity to manage the formation. The formation, correctly managed, continued to provide the cognitive capacity. The 1,000-year loop closes. Cross-references. Part 6, CH2, Scaphanders for Everyone. Part 6, CH5, Sleeping Inside the Aquifer. Part 11, CH1, Living Under Pressure. Part 11, CH2, The Nitrox Galleries. Part 11, CH3, Telomere Economics. Part 11, CH4, The Research Commons. Part 11, CH6, The Longevity Principality. Part 12, CH5, Sans a priori. For cognitive assessment protocol tool selection criteria and test-retest reliability threshold specification, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4 Slow-wave sleep monitoring methodology and sleep architecture longitudinal trajectory protocol, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4 Sensory environment cognitive stimulation assessment protocol and expertise development trajectory monitoring, see Appendix F, Biological Operations Manual. 4 Governance participation cognitive demand characterization and redeemer deliberative process cognitive assessment integration, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. 4 Cognitive enhancement mandatory publication protocol and transparent characterization standard, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. Pipe Dream. Part 11. Medicine and Longevity. Chapter 6. The Longevity Principality. The surface world has produced many civilizations organized around a single primary resource, the river valley that the agricultural surpluses accumulation enabled, the trade route that the commercial exchanges concentration produced, the mineral deposit that the extractive industries wealth generation required, and the port whose maritime commerce made it the civilization's most economically dynamic node. Each of these resource-organized civilizations built its institutional architecture, its governance, its legal framework, its economic relations, its cultural production, around the primary resources management, the primary resources protection, and the primary resources distribution among the stakeholders whose interests the governance framework had to accommodate to sustain the institutional architecture's legitimacy. The longevity principality is not simply the therapeutic depths management organized as a governance framework. It is the civilization organized around the recognition that the biological life well lived, the health span that the therapeutic environment enables in the individuals who inhabit it, is the primary resource whose management is the governance framework's most fundamental obligation, and that the institutional architecture built around this recognition produces a different governance philosophy, a different economic logic, and a different social organization than the mineral deposits, extraction economy, or the trade routes commercial economy produces. The distinction is not rhetorical. The civilization organized around the mineral deposits extraction produces the governance that manages the extraction's distribution among the extractors, the property rights, the royalties, the environmental regulations, the labor relations. The civilization organized around the biological life well lived produces the governance that manages the conditions in which the biological life's wellness occurs, the therapeutic environment's maintenance, the medical protocol's integrity, the research commons' scientific validity, and the community's social conditions whose quality is the biological life's most significant determinant after the therapeutic environment. The longevity principality's governance is the governance of the conditions in which life well lived occurs. The governance's quality is measured by the condition's quality. The condition's quality is measured by the community's biological health across the full design life's temporal span. The biological health across the full design life's temporal span is what the Founding Charter's primary governance objectives specify as the governance's purpose. The longevity principality's political philosophy. Every governance framework rests on a political philosophy, the theory of what the governance is for, what the governed community owes to the governing institution, and what the governing institution owes to the governed community. The surface world's liberal democratic philosophy specifies the governance's purpose as the protection of the individual rights, the liberty, the property, and the political participation, whose protection the governed community's consent has authorized the governance to provide through the representative institutions that the democratic election constitutes. The longevity principality's political philosophy is neither the liberal democracy's individual rights protection nor the authoritarian governance's collective benefits imposition. It is the biological commonwealth, the governance whose purpose is the maintenance of the biological conditions in which the permanent resident community's individual members can achieve the biological potential that their genetic endowment and their voluntary lifestyle choices make available in the therapeutic environment that the formation's conditions and the civilization's management together produce. The biological commonwealth's political philosophy has 3 foundational claims. The first is the environmental commons. The conditions in which the biological life well lived occurs are a commons asset whose management is the governance's primary obligation and whose privatization or depletion is the governance's primary failure. The therapeutic pressure, the nitrox atmosphere, the formation's ecological richness, and the research commons scientific contribution are not private goods whose distribution the market mechanism allocates. They are the commons that the permanent resident community inhabits collectively and that the governance must maintain for the full permanent resident community's benefit, not for the subset whose economic power would enable their exclusive access in the market mechanism's allocation. The second is the biological integrity. The governance's authority is legitimate to the extent that the governance's management of the environmental commons maintains the biological conditions in which the permanent resident community's members can achieve their biological potential. The governance that degrades the environmental commons conditions, that allows the therapeutic environment's quality to decline through the ecological management's neglect, the atmospheric management's failure, or the medical protocol's integrity's compromise, is the governance that has violated the biological commonwealth's political philosophy's foundational claim and lost the legitimacy that the philosophical foundation provides. The third is the temporal reciprocity. The permanent resident community's current members' governance decisions must account for the future permanent resident community's members' biological conditions. The decisions that maintain the environmental commons quality across the design life's temporal span are the decisions that the temporal reciprocity requires, and the decisions that consume the environmental commons quality for the current generation's benefit at the future generations' expense are the decisions that the temporal reciprocity's obligation prohibits. The Redeemer Framework's foundational layer's unmodifiable primary governance objectives are the temporal reciprocity's institutional expression, the ecological integrity that the current governance cannot compromise for the commercial return is the ecological integrity that the future governance's permanent resident community will inherit as the environmental commons quality. The longevity economy. The longevity principality's economic organization reflects the biological commonwealth's political philosophy in the specific economic forms that the therapeutic environment's management requires. The therapeutic environment's production is the longevity economy's foundational activity, the coordinating system's atmospheric management, the biological management protocol's ecological maintenance, the medical monitoring's clinical assessment, and the research commons scientific investigation together constitute the therapeutic environment's production, whose quality the longevity economy's primary output, the health span enhancement, depends on. The therapeutic environment's production cost is the longevity economy's most foundational economic parameter, the minimum expenditure whose sufficiency the therapeutic environment's quality maintenance requires is the floor below which the longevity economy cannot compress the production cost without the therapeutic environment's quality declining below the health span enhancement's biological requirement. The health span's economic valuation is the longevity economy's most philosophically challenging calculation. How does the governance assign an economic value to the health span's extension that the therapeutic environment produces in the permanent residence biology? The surface world's health economics has developed the quality-adjusted life year, QALY, as the health outcomes economic valuation metric, the number of years of life at full quality that the health intervention produces, valued at the willingness to pay estimate that the preference elicitation study has derived from the population's revealed or stated preferences. The QALY's application to the longevity program's health span extension produces the health economic calculation whose inputs, the years of health span extension at what quality level, valued at what willingness to pay, are the longitudinal datasets' most commercially significant outputs. The health economic calculation's result is the enrollment cost's value justification. The enrollment cost whose health span extension's QALY value exceeds the cost is the enrollment cost that the health economic calculation confirms as economically justified by the biological benefit. The longevity economy's most distinctive economic provision is the health span's distribution. The biological commonwealth's political philosophy requires that the health span enhancement's access not be exclusively available to the individuals whose financial resources support the full enrollment cost. The tiered enrollment model's subsidy provision is the economic mechanism that the biological commonwealth's philosophy requires as the health span distribution's implementation. The mechanism that prevents the health span enhancement from becoming the resource that the wealthy exclusively access, while the population whose biological conditions would benefit most from the therapeutic environment's conditions lacks the financial access. The health span distribution's economics is the longevity economy's most politically contested provision. the subsidy that extends the therapeutic environment's access to the enrolled participants whose financial resources cannot support the full enrollment cost requires the expansion reserve's contribution that the full cost enrollment's revenue generates, diverting the expansion reserve's capital from the expansion program's next installation deployment toward the current installations. Subsidy provision. The expansion program's deployment rate trades against the health span distribution's breadth. The Redeemer Framework's Annual Governance Council's resource allocation decision resolves the trade-off in the deliberative process whose information inputs are the expansion program's deployment rate's projected long-term return and the health span distribution's current breadth's social value. The trade-off between the long-term network value's capital accumulation and the current community's biological benefits' immediate realization. The deliberative process's resolution of this trade-off is the Longevity Principality's most consequential recurring governance decision, the decision that expresses most directly the governance's priorities between the civilization's future growth and the community's current well-being. The Longevity Governance's medical authority. The Longevity Principality's most distinctive governance feature is the medical authority's integration into the governance architecture as a concurrent authority rather than as an external advisory function, the Terraform operator's concurrent authorization, whose primary function throughout the governance architecture's preceding documentation has been the ecological and geological formation management's professional authority, is simultaneously the medical monitoring's clinical authority in the longevity program's governance. The medical authority's concurrent status in the governance architecture reflects the biological commonwealth's political philosophy's most specific institutional provision. The governance that is organized around the biological life well-lived cannot delegate the medical assessment of the conditions in which the biological life well-lived occurs to an external advisory function whose recommendations the governance council can accept or reject in the political deliberations outcome. The medical assessment of the therapeutic environment's quality is the governance's most fundamental informational input, the input without which the biological commonwealth's political philosophy's foundational claim of maintaining the biological conditions cannot be evaluated, and the input whose accuracy the governance's primary obligation requires at the level of concurrent authority rather than advisory recommendation. The concurrent medical authority's most specific governance expression is the individual enrolled participants' depth assignment protocol. The Terraform operator's clinical review of the enrolled participants' weekly bloodwork panel's results and the clinical assessment's implications for the depth assignment's revision is not the Governance Council's delegated advisory function, but the Terraform operator's concurrent authority whose professional judgment the depth assignment requires before. The coordinating system's transit management layer can implement the depth change that the revised assignment specifies. The concurrent medical authority cannot override the enrolled participants' autonomy. The depth assignment that the Terraform operator's clinical review specifies is the clinical recommendation whose implementation the enrolled participants' informed consent must authorize. The enrolled participant who declines the depth assignment revision that the Terraform operator's clinical review recommends is exercising the sovereignty provision's explicit autonomy right. The right that the founding charter's most fundamental political commitment to the voluntary nature of every residency decision extends to the enrolled participant's clinical decision about the therapeutic protocol's depth assignment. The enrolled participants' clinical autonomy and the Terraform operator's concurrent medical authority are the longevity governance's most philosophically significant dual provision. The governance that is organized around the biological life well-lived must maintain the medical authority that the biological welfare's protection requires while respecting the individual autonomy that the governance's voluntary legitimacy demands. The tension between the medical authority and the individual autonomy is the Longevity Principality's most persistent governance challenge, the challenge that the Redeemer Framework's conflict resolution protocol must address when the Terraform operator's clinical judgment and the enrolled participants' autonomous decision conflict. The Longevity Principality's cultural production. The civilization organized around the biological life well-lived produces the cultural artifacts, the art, the literature, the ceremonial practice, the communal celebration, whose specific character the civilization's specific conditions and the civilization's specific concerns generate as the cultural expression of the community that inhabits the therapeutic depths conditions and understands the biological life well-lived as the civilization's primary value. The Longevity Principality's cultural production is the founding document's most deliberately underspecified domain. The founding charter describes the governance architecture, the economic organization, the medical protocol, and the ecological management in the detail that the founding generation's planning can specify. The cultural production is the domain that the founding charter cannot specify in advance because the cultural production emerges from the community's lived experience in the formation's specific conditions, and the specific cultural expression that the lived experience produces is the community's own creation rather than the founding charter's specification. The founding charter's provision for the cultural production is the communal gallery's space, the architectural provision for the community's gathering that the cultural expression requires as its social context, and the Governance Council's Cultural Commons allocation. The expansion reserves annual allocation to the cultural programs whose proposal and selection the permanent resident community's governance process determines through the Redeemer Framework's Commons governance protocols. Annual cultural program cycle. The cultural programs that the First Generations Governance Council has selected from the permanent resident community's proposals reflect the community's specific conditions and concerns. The Formation Photography Exhibition, the visual documentation of the biological community's succession stages across the Crystal Tube Network's full extent over the first decade's monitoring record, is the cultural expression that the formation's visual richness and the community's ecological expertise together enable as the artistic practice whose specific character no surface world artist's context could produce. The depth music, the acoustic composition that uses the cenote's underwater soundscape as the primary sonic material, processed through the community's resident composer's artistic intelligence and the Research Commons acoustic monitoring equipment's recording capability, is the cultural expression that the formation's acoustic character and the community's artistic practice together enable as the sonic art whose specific material has never been available to the surface world's musical tradition. The formation feeds the cultural production with the material that the formation's specific sensory character provides, the visual complexity, the acoustic richness, the temporal dynamics of the biological community's succession, and the geological formation's spatial scale. And the community's creative intelligence transforms the material into the cultural expression that the permanent resident community's shared experience makes specifically meaningful to the community that inhabits the formation. The cultural production's most important institutional function is the community identity's formation. The civilization organized around the biological life, well-lived, requires the shared cultural identity that the community's specific conditions and the community's specific artistic expression together generate as the sense of collective meaning that the governance authority's legitimacy ultimately rests on. The community that shares the formation's ecological encounter, the therapeutic environment's biological experience, and the cultural expression that these produce is the community whose shared identity makes the governance's authority meaningful rather than merely functional. The Longevity Principality's governance derives its legitimacy from the community's voluntary residency, the biological commonwealth's philosophical foundation, and the cultural identity's shared meaning. The three together are the governance's political foundation, the foundation that the founding charter specifies in the governance architecture, the philosophical provisions, and the cultural commons allocation, leaving the specific cultural expression to the community's own creation in the formation's specific conditions. The Longevity Principality and the surface world. The Longevity Principality's relationship to the surface world is the relationship between a civilization organized around the biological life, well-lived, and the civilizations organized around the resource extraction, the commercial exchange, and the political power whose management the surface world's governance frameworks have primarily addressed. The relationship is not adversarial. The Longevity Principality is not the surface world's critique, but the surface world's alternative for the specific population whose circumstances, resources, and values have led them to choose the therapeutic depths conditions over the surface world's atmospheric environment. The Principality does not claim superiority to the surface world's governance. It claims the right to govern its own community's conditions according to the biological commonwealth's philosophy, without the surface world's governance imposing its own philosophical framework on the Principality's community. The relationship's most practically significant dimension is the surface world's scientific engagement with the Research Commons. the pharmaceutical industry's licensing negotiations, the academic institutions' fellowship collaborations, the National Health System's actuarial assessments, and the regulatory agency's clinical evidence evaluations all constitute the surface world's scientific community's engagement with the Research Commons longitudinal dataset and the therapeutic claims. Evidence base. The engagement is the most important dimension of the surface world's relationship to the longevity principality because the engagement produces the scientific credibility that the longevity program's commercial model requires and the actuarial validation that the insurance industry's reimbursement adoption demands. The most consequential future event in the longevity principality's relationship to the surface world is the insurance industry's actuarial adoption of the longevity program's enrollment cost as the preventive health investment whose chronic condition onset delay the decade-scale longitudinal evidence has confirmed. This event, whose timing the longitudinal dataset's accumulation rate and the actuarial industry's evaluation process together determine, is the commercial model's scaling event that the founding charter's economic architecture has been designed to reach. The transition from the individual enrollment's out-of-pocket investment to the insured population's preventive health coverage, whose scale produces the enrolled population size that the Research Commons statistical power fully realizes. The insurance industry's actuarial adoption is the longevity principality's most significant recognition event, not the legal category's sovereignty recognition that the habitation record's long-horizon accumulation is building toward, but the economic recognition that the therapeutic environment's biological benefit produces an actuarially measurable value that the health system's economic logic acknowledges as the preventive investment whose return the chronic condition's management cost exceeds. The economic recognition precedes the legal recognition. The economic recognition validates the biological claim. The biological claim is what the formation produces in the biology that inhabits it. The formation has been producing it for 66 million years. The longitudinal dataset is measuring what the formation produces. The actuarial calculation is valuing what the longitudinal dataset measures. The economic recognition is the surface world's acknowledgement of what the formation's conditions have always been producing in the biology. The formation produces. The biology responds. The science measures. The actuarial table values. The recognition follows. What Part 11 has built. Part She's 6 chapters have documented the medicine and longevity program's complete architecture, from the physiological mechanism to the institutional expression. Chapter 1 established the pressure physiology's mechanistic foundation, the specific biological pathways through which the therapeutic pressure's continuous exposure produces the telomere extension, the inflammatory reduction, and the cardiovascular efficiency enhancement that the clinical protocol targets. Chapter 2 established the nitrox galleries as the therapeutic environment's physical expression, the continuous atmospheric immersion that the residential enrollment provides as the biological life, well-lived's daily context rather than the session-based treatment that the hyperbaric chamber's clinical scheduling produces. Chapter 3 established the telomere economics as the therapeutic effects commercial translation, the actuarial argument whose longitudinal evidence based the Research Commons scientific program is accumulating toward the insurance industry's reimbursement adoption that the commercial model's scaling requires. Chapter 4 established the Research Commons as the scientific infrastructure whose institutional design, the enrolled population's continuity, the longitudinal depth's temporal accumulation, the residential expertise's cross-disciplinary integration, and the data commons constitutional governance, produces the scientific evidence base that the therapeutic claim's credibility requires. Chapter 5 established the cognitive enhancement at depth as the therapeutic environment's most comprehensive human benefit, the cognitive profile that the formation's anti-inflammatory biology, the enhanced oxygen delivery, the improved sleep architecture, the sensory enrichment, and the social cognitive engagement together produce in the permanent resident community. Chapter 6 has established the longevity principality as the institutional synthesis, the civilization organized around the biological life, well-lived whose governance philosophy, economic organization, medical authority, cultural production, and surface world relationship constitute the political form that the biological commonwealth's specific values and the therapeutic environment's specific conditions together generate. Together, the 6 chapters constitute the full architecture of a civilization whose primary resource is the biological conditions in which human life reaches its biological potential, the most fundamental resource that any civilization has ever organized itself around. Expressed in the specific institutional forms that the Chicxulub-Arc's cenote formation's specific conditions and the founding charter's specific governance philosophy have produced as the longevity principality. The principality exists. The therapeutic environment is maintained. The community inhabits it. The biology responds. The science measures the response. The governance protects the conditions. The conditions continue. The response continues. The biological life well lived is the civilization. The civilization is inside the formation. The formation is 66 million years old. The civilization is the formation's newest biological expression, managed by its own intelligence, for its own longevity, in the conditions that the formation itself provides. Cross-references. Part 8, Section A, CH4, From Resort to Municipality. Part 8, Section A, CH5, The Economics of Infinite Expansion. Part 9, CH4, Redeemer as Governance OS. Part 9, CH5, The Commons Ownership Principle. Part 11, CH1, Living Under Pressure. Part 11, CH2, The Nitrox Galleries. Part 11, CH3, Telomere Economics. Part 11, CH4, The Research Commons. Part 11, CH5, Cognitive Enhancement at Depth. Part 12, CH6, Why Pipe Dream Changed Everything. For Longevity Principality Governance, Council Medical Authority Integration Protocol, and Terraform Operator Clinical Concurrent Authorization Specification. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Biological Commonwealth Political Philosophy Provision in Redeemer Foundational Layer Constitutional Status. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Cultural Commons Allocation Protocol and Annual Cultural Program Selection Governance Cycle. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Insurance Industry Actuarial Adoption Timeline Assessment and Commercial Model Scaling Event Criteria, see Appendix E, Economic Architecture. End of Part 11, Medicine and Longevity. Discussion about this episode. Comments. ResTax. Recent episodes. Pipe Dream Part 10. July 22nd MXDM, aka Pirate 1, VJ, Cinemiex. Pipe Dream Part 9. July 21st MXDM, aka Pirate 1, VJ, Cinemiex. Pipe Dream Part 8 Section B.
Juli 19 MXTM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunamix.
Pipe Dream Part 7 Updated. July 8.
This is the brief on the Post-Corporate Transition District. Today, we're giving you the ultimate Reader's Digest summary of a massive, dense manifesto on building a self-sustaining post-corporate civilization in Aldea Zama, Tulum, breaking down exactly how displaced professionals are creating a brand new society. Let's dive right into how they structure their time, create a shared culture, and actually use that culture to secure real estate. First, they run on a strict 7-day rhythm to build truly independent, sovereign individuals. Their week is packed. You've got Monday AI landscape syncs, Thursday hard knowledge dinners to get emotionally raw about the true costs of this lifestyle, and Friday reality stress tests for their projects. Now, you might wonder, is this just a rebranded corporate sprint? Well, no. Think of it as an operating system optimized for human independence rather than just shareholder value. Second, because a new civilization needs a shared identity, they use collaborative sci-fi, literally world-building a universe called Super-Earth, to rehearse for the future. They anchor this culture using NFPs, or non-fungible publications. These are actual beautifully designed printed books. So why on earth are forward-thinking tech nomads reverting to ancient technology like printed books? It's basically planting a physical flag in a digital storm that online platforms simply can't delete. Finally, you can't pitch landlords a philosophical utopia. You gotta speak their financial language. They use an experimental accommodation model, convincing owners to transform vacant spaces into short-term pilot activation nodes. So how do you sell a utopia to a landlord? It's exactly like staging an empty house for sale, but here they're staging a vibrant community to birth a civilization. Ultimately, building a new society requires way more than just remote work. It demands a rigorous shared rhythm, physical cultural artifacts, and practical alignment with local economics.
This isn't a drop.
NFPs
Position
are
is,
here.
not a print.
Signed,
Position.
priced,
MXTM
split.
Studio.
You must bleed in. Secret. Receive the final upsell. Ascend or expire in the end. Redeemer isn't an app. It's a new covenant economy, where death is the subscription fee and resurrection is the brand. God mode. Invite only. Mission bound. Ethically nullified. Available only to those too important to die. Apply never. Be chosen. Hashtag Redeemer. Hashtag God mode. Hashtag UHNWI. Hashtag non-person peace. Hashtag Ascension Protocol. Hashtag Covenant Economy. Hashtag MXDM. Hashtag Newest Newsnet. Hashtag Chrome Redemption. Hashtag The End of the World is Cancelled. Copyright 2025 MXDM and VJTSU. Martin Chartrand. Ein speech bubble transmitting from the other side of the firewall. https://mxdm.substack.com/p/welcome-to-redeemer https://mxdm.substack.com/p/welcome-to-redeemer. I got you. Here's a hashtag string tailored for Substack and X. Hashtag Redeemer, hashtag God mode, hashtag Ultra Rescue, hashtag UHNWI, hashtag Chrome Salvation, hashtag Posthuman Peace, hashtag Ascension Protocol, hashtag Non-Personhood, hashtag Lease Your Soul, hashtag VIP Extraction, hashtag Covenant Economy, hashtag Tactical Redemption, hashtag MXDM, hashtag VJTSU, hashtag Newest Newsnet, hashtag The End of the World is Cancelled. Red Heart Publish It Loud. You're changing the game.
This isn't a drop.
NFPs
Position
are
is,
here.
not a print.
Signed,
Position.
priced,
MXTM
split.
Studio.
Yeah. No gas fees in the ink, baby. No chain, still unbreakable. Pirate signal. Print it.
Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. QR in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it FP Vision. Paper over pixels, weight in my hands. No server can kill what the ink understands. You minted a maybe, I'm issuing plans. You got a receipt, you got terms in the brand. They sold you a link, set down the illusion. JPay dreams on a blockchain, confusion. While I got hacked, now who you suing? Ownership ghosted, platforms dissolving. I'm off that vapor, I deal in matter. Ink hit paper, now it hit matter. Ink hit paper, now it hits harder. Signature cuts through noise and chatter. This artifact talks, your token just flatter. This artifact talks, your token just flatter. URL tied, but the object's the anchor. Price on the back like a sanction and transfer. Percentage locked, I don't answer the bankers. This is a ledger leaf carved by the author. Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. QR in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it FP Vision. Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging. This is first contact, physical pledging.